Division 7 of Human, All Too Human, a book for free spirits by Friedrich Nietzsche, translated by Helen ZIMMERN. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Seventh Division, Wife and Child, 377, The Perfect Woman. The perfect woman is a higher type of humanity than the perfect man, and also something much rarer. The natural history of animals furnishes grounds in support of this theory. 378. Friendship and Marriage. The best friend will probably get the best wife, because a good marriage is based on talent for friendship. 379. The survival of the parents. The undissolved dissonances in the relation of the character and sentiments of the parents survive in the nature of the child, and make up the history of its inner sufferings. 380. Inherited from the mother. Everyone bears within him an image of woman, inherited from his mother. It determines his attitude towards women as a whole, whether to honor, despise, or remain generally indifferent to them. 381. Correcting nature. Whoever has not got a good father should procure one. 382. Fathers and Sons. Fathers have much to do to make amends for having sons. 383. The error of gentlewomen. Gentlewomen think that a thing does not really exist when it is not possible to talk of it in society. 384. A male disease. The surest remedy for the male disease of self-contempt is to be loved by a sensible woman. 385. A species of jealousy. Mothers are readily jealous of the friends of sons who are particularly successful. As a rule, a mother loves herself in her son more than the son. 386. Rational irrationality. In the maturity of life and intelligence, the feeling comes over a man that his father did wrong in begetting him. 387. Maternal excellence. Some mothers need happy and honored children, some need unhappy ones, otherwise they cannot exhibit their maternal excellence. 388. Different sighs. Some husbands have sighed over the elopement of their wives. The greater number, however, have sighed because nobody would elope with theirs. 389. Love matches. Marriages which are contracted for love, so-called love matches, have error for their father and need, necessity for their mother. 390. Women's friendships. Women can enter into friendship with a man perfectly well, but in order to maintain it, the aid of a little physical antipathy is perhaps required. 391. Ennui. Many people, especially women, never feel ennui because they have never learnt to work properly. 392. An element of love. In all feminine love, something of maternal love also comes to light. 393. Unity of place in drama. If married couples did not live together, happy marriages would be more frequent. 394. The usual consequences of marriage. All intercourse which does not elevate a person debases him, and vice versa. Hence, men usually sink a little when they marry, while women are somewhat elevated. Over-intellectual men require marriage in proportion as they are opposed to it as to a repugnant medicine. 395. Learning to command. Children of unpretentious families must be taught to command, just as much as other children must be taught to obey. 396. Wanting to be in love. Betrothed couples who have been matched by convenience often exert themselves to fall in love, to avoid the reproach of cold, calculating expediency. In the same manner, those who become converts to Christianity for their advantage exert themselves to become genuinely pious, because the religious cast of countenance then becomes easier to them. 397. No standing still in love. A musician who loves the slow tempo will play the same pieces ever more slowly. There is thus no standing still in any love. 398. Modesty. Women's modesty usually increases with their beauty. 399. Marriage on a good basis. A marriage in which each wishes to realize an individual aim by means of the other will stand well. For instance, when the woman wishes to become famous through the man, and the man beloved through the woman. 400. Proteus nature. Through love, women actually become what they appear to be in the imagination of their lovers. 401. To love and to possess. As a rule, women love a distinguished man to the extent that they wish to possess him exclusively. They would gladly keep him under lock and key if their vanity did not forbid, but vanity demands that he should also appear distinguished before others. 402. The test of a good marriage. The goodness of a marriage is proved by the fact that it can stand an exception. 403. Bringing any one round to anything. One may make any person so weak and weary by disquietude, anxiety, and excess of work or thought, that he no longer resists anything that appears complicated, but gives way to it. Diplomatists and women know this. 404. Propriety and honesty. Those girls who mean to trust exclusively to their youthful charms for their provision in life, and whose cunning is further prompted by worldly mothers, have just the same aims as courtesans, only they are wiser and less honest. 405. Masks. There are women who, wherever one examines them, have no inside, but are mere masks. A man is to be pitied who has connection with such almost spectre-like and necessarily unsatisfactory creatures. But it is precisely such women who know how to excite a man's desire most strongly. He seeks for their soul, and seeks evermore. 406. Marriage is a long talk. In entering on a marriage, one should ask one's self the question, do you think you will pass your time well with this woman till your old age? All else in marriage is transitory. Talk, however, occupies most of the time of the association. 407. Girlish dreams. Inexperienced girls flatter themselves with the notion that it is in their power to make a man happy. Later on, they learn that it is equivalent to underrating a man to suppose that he needs only a girl to make him happy. Women's vanity requires a man to be something more than merely a happy husband. 408. The dying out of Faust and Marguerite. According to the very intelligent remark of a scholar, the educated men of modern Germany resemble somewhat a mixture of Mephistopheles and Wagner, but are not at all like Faust, whom our grandfathers, in their youth at least, felt agitating within them. To them, therefore, to continue the remark, Marguerites are not suited for two reasons, and because the latter are no longer desired, they seem to be dying out. 409. Classical education for girls. For goodness' sake, let us not give our classical education to girls, an education which, out of ingenious, inquisitive, ardent youths, so frequently makes copies of their teacher. 410. Without rivals. Women readily perceive in a man whether his soul has already been taken possession of. They wish to be loved without rivals, and find fault with the objects of his ambition, his political tasks, his sciences and arts, if he have a passion for such things. Unless he be distinguished thereby, then in the case of a love relationship between them, women look at the same time for an increase of their own distinction. Under such circumstances they favor the lover. 411. The feminine intellect. The intellect of women manifests itself as perfect mastery, presence of mind, and utilization of all advantages. They transmit it as a fundamental quality to their children, and the father adds thereto the darker background of the will. His influence determines, as it were, the rhythm and harmony with which the new life is to be performed, but its melody is derived from the mother. For those who know how to put a thing properly, women have intelligence, men have character and passion. This does not contradict the fact that men, actually achieve so much more with their intelligence. They have deeper and more powerful impulses, and it is these which carry their understanding, in itself something passive, to such an extent. Women are often silently surprised at the great respect men pay to their character. When, therefore, in the choice of a partner men seek specially for a being of deep and strong character, and women for a being of intelligence, brilliancy, and presence of mind, it is plain that at bottom men seek for the ideal man, and women for the ideal woman, consequently not for the complement, but for the completion of their own excellence. 412. Hesiod's opinion confirmed. It is a sign of women's wisdom that they have almost always known how to get themselves supported, like drones in a beehive. Let us just consider what this meant originally, and why men do not depend upon women for their support. Of a truth, it is because masculine vanity and reverence are greater than feminine wisdom, for women have known how to secure for themselves by their subordination the greatest advantage, in fact, the upper hand. Even the care of children may originally have been used by the wisdom of women as an excuse for withdrawing themselves as much as possible from work. And at present they still understand, when they are really active, as housekeepers for instance, how to make a bewildering fuss about it, so that the merit of their activity is usually 10 times overestimated by men. 413. Lovers as short-sighted people. A pair of powerful spectacles has sometimes sufficed to cure a person in love, and whoever has had sufficient imagination to represent a face or form 20 years older has probably gone through life not much disturbed. 414. Women in hatred. In a state of hatred, women are more dangerous than men, for one thing, because they are hampered by no regard for fairness when their hostile feelings have been aroused, but let their hatred develop unchecked to its utmost consequences, then also because they are expert in finding sore spots, which every man and every party possess, and pouncing upon them, for which purpose their dagger-pointed intelligence is of good service, whilst men, hesitating at the sight of wounds, are often generously and conciliatorily inclined. 415. Love. The love idolatry which women practice is fundamentally and originally an intelligent device, inasmuch as they increase their power by all the idealizings of love, and exhibit themselves as so much the more desirable in the eyes of men. But by being accustomed for centuries to this exaggerated appreciation of love, it has come to pass that they have been caught in their own net, and have forgotten the origin of the device. They themselves are now still more deceived than the men, and on that account also suffer more from the disillusionment which almost necessarily enters into the life of every woman, so far at any rate as she has sufficient imagination and intelligence to be able to be deceived and undeceived. 416. The emancipation of women. Can women be at all just when they are so accustomed to love and to be immediately biased for or against? For that reason they are also less interested in things and more in individuals. But when they are interested in things, they immediately become their partisans, and thereby spoil their pure, innocent effect. Thus there arises a danger, by no means small, in entrusting politics and certain portions of science to them, history for instance, for what is rarer than a woman who really knows what science is? Indeed, the best of them cherish in their breasts a secret scorn for science, as if they were somehow superior to it. Perhaps all this can be changed in time, but meanwhile it is so. 417. The inspiration in women's judgments. The sudden decisions for or against which women are in the habit of making, the flashing illumination of personal relations caused by their spasmodic inclinations and aversions, in short, the proofs of feminine injustice, have been invested with a lustre by men who are in love, as if all women had inspirations of wisdom, even without the Delphic cauldron and the laurel wreaths, and their utterances are interpreted and duly set forth as Sibylline oracles for long afterwards. When one considers, however, that for every person and for every cause something can be said in favor of it, but equally also something against it, that things are not only two-sided but also three and four-sided, it is almost difficult to be entirely at fault in such sudden decisions. Indeed, it might be said that the nature of things has been so arranged that women should always carry their point. 418. Being loved. As one of every two persons in love is usually the one who loves, the other the one who is loved, the belief has arisen that in every love affair there is a constant amount of love, and that the more of it the one person monopolizes, the less is left for the other. Exceptionally, it happens that the vanity of each of the parties persuades him or her that it is he or she who must be loved, so that both of them wish to be loved, from which cause many half funny, half absurd scenes take place, especially in married life. 419. Contradiction in feminine minds. Owing to the fact that women are so much more personal than objective, there are tendencies included in the range of their ideas which are logically in contradiction to one another. They are accustomed in turn to become enthusiastically fond just of the representatives of these tendencies, and accept their systems in the lump, but in such wise that a dead place originates wherever a new personality afterwards gets the ascendancy. It may happen that the whole philosophy in the mind of an old lady consists of nothing but such dead places. 420. Who suffers the more? After a personal dissension and quarrel between a woman and a man, the latter party suffers chiefly from the idea of having wounded the other, whilst the former suffers chiefly from the idea of not having wounded the other sufficiently. So she subsequently endeavors by tears, sobs, and discomposed mien to make his heart heavier. 421. An opportunity for feminine magnanimity. If we could disregard the claims of custom in our thinking, we might consider whether nature and reason do not suggest several marriages for men, one after another. Perhaps that, at the age of 22, he should first marry an older girl who is mentally and morally his superior, and can be his leader through all the dangers of the 20s, ambition, hatred, self-contempt, and passions of all kinds. This woman's affection would subsequently change entirely into maternal love, and she would not only submit to it, but would encourage the man in the most salutary manner, if in his 30s he contracted an alliance with quite a young girl, whose education he himself should take in hand. Marriage is a necessary institution for the 20s, a useful but not necessary institution for the 30s. For later life it is often harmful, and promotes the mental deterioration of the man. 422. The tragedy of childhood. Perhaps it not infrequently happens that noble men with lofty aims have to fight their hardest battle in childhood, by having perchance to carry out their principles in opposition to a base-minded father addicted to feigning and falsehood, or living like Lord Byron in constant warfare with a childish and passionate mother. He who has had such an experience will never be able to forget all his life who has been his greatest and most dangerous enemy. 423. Parental folly. The grossest mistakes in judging a man are made by his parents. This is a fact, but how is it to be explained? Have the parents too much experience of the child, and cannot any longer arrange this experience into a unity? It has been noticed that it is only in the earlier period of their sojourn in foreign countries that travelers rightly grasp the general distinguishing features of a people. The better they come to know it, they are the less able to see what is typical and distinguishing in a people. As soon as they grow short-sighted, their eyes cease to be long-sighted. Do parents, therefore, judge their children falsely because they have never stood far enough away from them? The following is quite another explanation. People are no longer accustomed to reflect on what is close at hand and surrounds them, but just accept it. Perhaps the usual thoughtlessness of parents is the reason why they judge so wrongly when once they are compelled to judge their children. 424. The future of marriage. The noble and liberal-minded women who take as their mission the education and elevation of the female sex should not overlook one point of view. Marriage, regarded in its highest aspect as the spiritual friendship of two persons of opposite sexes, and accordingly such as is hoped for in future, contracted for the purpose of producing and educating a new generation. Such marriage, which only makes use of the sensual, so to speak, as a rare and occasional means to a higher purpose, will, it is to be feared, probably need a natural auxiliary, namely concubinage. For if on the grounds of his health the wife is also to serve for the sole satisfaction of the man's sexual needs, a wrong perspective, opposed to the aims indicated, will have most influence in the choice of a wife. The aims referred to, the production of descendants will be accidental, and their successful education highly improbable. A good wife, who has to be friend, helper, childbearer, mother, family head, and manager, and has even perhaps to conduct her own business and affairs separately from those of the husband, cannot at the same time be a concubine. It would in general be asking too much of her. In the future, therefore, a state of things might take place the opposite of what existed at Athens in the time of Pericles. The men, whose wives were then little more to them than concubines, turned besides to the Aspasias, because they longed for the charms of a companionship gratifying both to head and heart, such as the grace and intellectual suppleness of women could alone provide. All human institutions, just like marriage, allow only a moderate amount of practical idealizing, failing which coarse remedies immediately become necessary. 425. The storm and stress period of women. In the 3 or 4 civilized countries of Europe, it is possible by several centuries of education to make out of women anything we like. Even men, not in a sexual sense, of course, but in every other. Under such influences they will acquire all the masculine virtues and forces. At the same time, of course, they must also have taken all the masculine weaknesses and vices into the bargain. So much as has been said, we can I command. But how shall we endure the intermediate state thereby induced, which may even last 2 or 3 centuries, during which feminine follies and injustices, woman's original birthday endowment, will still maintain the ascendancy over all that has been otherwise gained and acquired? This will be the time when indignation will be the peculiar masculine passion, indignation because all arts and sciences have been overflowed and choked by an unprecedented dilettantism, philosophy talked to death by brain-bewildering chatter, politics more fantastic and partisan than ever, and society in complete disorganization, because the conservatresses of ancient customs have become ridiculous to themselves and have endeavored in every way to place themselves outside the pale of custom. If indeed women had their greatest power in custom, where will they have to look in order to reacquire a similar plenitude of power after having renounced custom? 426. Free spirit in marriage. Will free thinkers live with women? In general, I think that, like the prophesying birds of old, like the truth thinkers and truth speakers of the present, they must prefer to fly alone. 427. The happiness of marriage. Everything to which we are accustomed draws an ever-tightening cobweb net around us, and presently we notice that the threads have become cords, and that we ourselves sit in the middle like a spider that has here got itself caught and must feed on its own blood. Hence the free spirit hates all rules and customs, all that is permanent and definitive. Hence he painfully tears asunder again and again the net around him, though in consequence thereof he will suffer from numerous wounds, slight and severe, for he must break off every thread from himself, from his body and soul. He must learn to love where he has hitherto hated, and vice versa. Indeed, it must not be a thing impossible for him to sow dragon's teeth in the same field in which he formerly scattered the abundance of his bounty. From this it can be inferred whether he is suited for the happiness of marriage. 428. Too intimate. When we live on too intimate terms with a person, it is as if we were again and again handling a good engraving with our fingers. The time comes when we have soiled and damaged paper in our hands, and nothing more. A man's soul also gets worn out by constant handling. At least it eventually appears so to us. Never again do we see its original design and beauty. We always lose through too familiar association with women and friends, and sometimes we lose the pearl of our life thereby. 429. The golden cradle. The free spirit will always feel relieved when he has finally resolved to shake off the motherly care and guardianship with which women surround him. What harm will a rough wind, from which he has been so anxiously protected, do him? Of what consequence is a genuine disadvantage, loss, misfortune, sickness, illness, fault, or folly, more or less, in his life, compared with the bondage of the golden cradle, the peacock's feather fan, and the oppressive feeling that he must, in addition, be grateful because he is waited on and spoiled like a baby? Hence it is that the milk which is offered him by the motherly disposition of the women about him can so readily turn into gall. 430. A voluntary victim. There is nothing by which able women can so alleviate the lives of their husbands, should these be great and famous, as by becoming, so to speak, the receptacle for the general disfavor and occasional ill humor of the rest of mankind. Contemporaries are usually accustomed to overlook many mistakes, follies, and even flagrant injustices in their great men, if only they can find someone to maltreat and kill as a proper victim for the relief of their feelings. A wife not infrequently has the ambition to present herself for this sacrifice, and then the husband may indeed feel satisfied, he being enough of an egoist to have such a voluntary storm, rain, and lightning conductor beside him. 431. Agreeable adversaries. The natural inclination of women towards quiet, regular, happily tuned existences and intercourse, the oil-like and calming effect of their influence upon the sea of life, operates unconsciously against the heroic inner impulse of the free spirit. Without knowing it, women act as if they were taking away the stones from the path of the wandering mineralogist, in order that he might not strike his foot against them, when he has gone out for the very purpose of striking against them. 432. The discord of two concords. Woman wants to serve, and finds her happiness therein. The free spirit does not want to be served, and therein finds his happiness. 433. Xanthippe. Socrates found a wife such as he required, but he would not have sought her had he known her sufficiently well. Even the heroism of his free spirit would not have gone so far. As a matter of fact, Xanthippe forced him more and more into his peculiar profession, inasmuch as she made house and home doleful and dismal to him. She taught him to live in the streets, and wherever gossiping and idling went on, and thereby made him the greatest Athenian street dialectician, who had at last to compare himself to a gadfly which a god had set on the neck of the beautiful horse Athens to prevent it from resting. 434. Blind to the future. Just as mothers have senses and eye only for those pains of their children that are evident to the senses and eye, so the wives of men of high aspirations cannot accustom themselves to see their husbands suffering, starving, or slighted, although all this is perhaps not only the proof that they have rightly chosen their attitude in life, but even the guarantee that their great aims must be achieved sometime. Women always intrigue privately against the higher souls of their husbands. They want to cheat them out of their future for the sake of a painless and comfortable present. 435. Authority and freedom. However highly women may honor their husbands, they honor still more the powers and ideas recognized by society. They have been accustomed for millennia to go along with their hands folded on their breasts, and their heads bent before everything dominant, disapproving of all resistance to public authority. They therefore unintentionally, as if from instinct, hang themselves as a drag on the wheels of free-spirited, independent endeavor, and in certain circumstances make their husbands highly impatient, especially when the latter persuade themselves that it is really love which prompts the action of their wives. To disapprove of women's methods and generously to honor the motives that prompt them, that is man's nature, and often enough his despair. 436. Ceterum censeo. It is laughable when a company of paupers decree the abolition of the right of inheritance, and it is not less laughable when childless persons labor for the practical law-giving of a country. They have not enough ballast in their ship to sail safely over the ocean of the future. But it seems equally senseless if a man who has chosen for his mission the widest knowledge and estimation of universal existence burdens himself with personal considerations for a family, with the support, protection, and care of wife and child, and in front of his telescope hangs that gloomy veil through which hardly a ray from the distant firmament can penetrate. Thus I too agree with the opinion that in matters of the highest philosophy all married men are to be suspected. 437. Finally, there are many kinds of hemlock, and fate generally finds an opportunity to put a cup of this poison to the lips of the free spirit, in order to punish him, as every one then says. What do the women do about him then? They cry and lament, and perhaps disturb the sunset calm of the thinker, as they did in the prison at Athens. O Crito, bid some one take those women away, said Socrates at last. End of Division 7. Division 8, Part 1 of Human, All Too Human, a book for free spirits by Friedrich Nietzsche, translated by Helen Zimmern. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 8th Division, A Glance at the State, Part 1. 438. Asking to be heard. The demagogic disposition and the intention of working upon the masses is at present common to all political parties. On this account they are all obliged to change their principles into great al fresco follies, and thus make a show of them. In this matter there is no further alteration to be made. Indeed, it is superfluous even to raise a finger against it. For here Voltaire's saying applies: Quand la populace se meurt de raisonner, tout est perdu. Since this has happened, we have to accommodate ourselves to the new conditions, as we have to accommodate ourselves when an earthquake has displaced the old boundaries and the contour of the land and altered the value of property. Moreover, when it is once for all a question in the politics of all parties to make life endurable to the greatest possible majority, this majority may always decide what they understand by an endurable life. If they believe their intellect capable of finding the right means to this end, why should we doubt about it? They want, once for all, to be the architects of their own good or ill fortune, and if their feeling of free choice and their pride in the 5 or 6 ideas that their brain conceals and brings to light really makes life so agreeable to them that they gladly put up with the fatal consequences of their narrow-mindedness, there is little to object to, provided that their narrow-mindedness does not go so far as to demand that everything shall become politics in this sense, that all shall live and act according to this standard. For in the first place, it must be more than ever permissible for some people to keep aloof from politics and to stand somewhat aside. To this they are also impelled by the pleasure of free choice, and connected with this there may even be some little pride in keeping silence when too many, and only the many, are speaking. Then this small group must be excused if they do not attach such great importance to the happiness of the majority. Nations or strata of population may be understood thereby, and are occasionally guilty of an ironical grimace, for their seriousness lies elsewhere, their conception of happiness is quite different, and their aim cannot be encompassed by every clumsy hand that has just 5 fingers. Finally, there comes from time to time what is certainly most difficult to concede to them, but must also be conceded, a moment when they emerge from their silent solitariness and try once more the strength of their lungs. They then call to each other like people lost in a wood, to make themselves known, and for mutual encouragement, whereby, to be sure, much becomes audible that sounds evil to ears for which it is not intended. Soon, however, silence again prevails in the wood, such silence that the buzzing, humming, and fluttering of the countless insects that live in, above, and beneath it are again plainly heard. 439. Culture and Caste. A higher culture can only originate where there are 2 distinct castes of society, that of the working class and that of the leisured class, who are capable of true leisure; or, more strongly expressed, the caste of compulsory labor and the caste of free labor. The point of view of the division of happiness is not essential when it is a question of the production of a higher culture. In any case, however, the leisured caste is more susceptible to suffering and suffer more. Their pleasure in existence is less, and their task is greater. Now, supposing there should be quite an interchange between the 2 castes, so that on the one hand the duller and less intelligent families and individuals are lowered from the higher caste into the lower, and on the other hand the freer men of the lower caste obtain access to the higher, a condition of things would be attained beyond which one can only perceive the open sea of vague wishes. Thus speaks to us the vanishing voice of the olden time, but where are there still ears to hear it? 440. Of good blood. That which men and women of good blood possess much more than others, and which gives them an undoubted right to be more highly appreciated, are 2 arts which are always increased by inheritance: the art of being able to command, and the art of proud obedience. Now, wherever commanding is the business of the day, as in the great world of commerce and industry, there results something similar to these families of good blood. Only the noble bearing in obedience is lacking, which is an inheritance from feudal conditions, and hardly grows any longer in the climate of our culture. 441. Subordination. The subordination which is so highly valued in military and official ranks will soon become as incredible to us as the secret tactics of the Jesuits have already become. And when this subordination is no longer possible, a multitude of astonishing results will no longer be attained, and the world will be all the poorer. It must disappear, for its foundation is disappearing. The belief in unconditional authority, in ultimate truth, even in military ranks, physical compulsion is not sufficient to produce it, but only the inherited adoration of the princely as of something superhuman. In freer circumstances, people subordinate themselves only on conditions, in compliance with a mutual contract, consequently with all the provisos of self-interest. 442. The National Army. The greatest disadvantage of the national army, now so much glorified, lies in the squandering of men of the highest civilization. It is only by the favorableness of all circumstances that there are such men at all. How carefully and anxiously should we deal with them, since long periods are required to create the chance conditions for the production of such delicately organized brains. But as the Greeks wallowed in the blood of Greeks, so do Europeans now in the blood of Europeans, and indeed, taken relatively, it is mostly the highly cultivated who are sacrificed, those who promise an abundant and excellent posterity, for such stand in the front of the battle as commanders, and also expose themselves to most danger by reason of their higher ambition. At present, when quite other and higher tasks are assigned than patria and honor, the rough Roman patriotism is either something dishonorable or a sign of being behind the times. 443. Hope as presumption. Our social order will slowly melt away, as all former orders have done, as soon as the suns of new opinions have shone upon mankind with a new glow. We can only wish this melting away in the hope thereof, and we are only reasonably entitled to hope when we believe that we and our equals have more strength in heart and head than the representatives of the existing state of things. As a rule, therefore, this hope will be a presumption, an overestimation. 444. War. Against war it may be said that it makes the victor stupid and the vanquished revengeful. In favor of war it may be said that it barbarizes in both its above-named results, and thereby makes more natural. It is the sleep or the winter period of culture. Man emerges from it with greater strength for good and for evil. 445. In the prince's service. To be able to act quite regardlessly, it is best for a statesman to carry out his work, not for himself, but for a prince. The eye of the spectator is dazzled by the splendor of this general disinterestedness, so that it does not see the malignancy and severity which the work of a statesman brings with it. 446. A question of power, not of right. As regards socialism, in the eyes of those who always consider higher utility, if it is really arising against their oppressors of those who for centuries have been oppressed and downtrodden, there is no problem of right involved, notwithstanding the ridiculous effeminate question, how far ought we to grant its demands, but only a problem of power. The same, therefore, as in the case of a natural force, steam for instance, which is either forced by man into his service as a machine god, or which, in case of defects of the machine, that is to say, defects of human calculation, in its construction destroys it and man together. In order to solve this question of power, we must know how strong socialism is, in what modification it may yet be employed as a powerful lever in the present mechanism of political forces. Under certain circumstances, we should do all we can to strengthen it. With every great force, be it the most dangerous, men have to think how they can make of it an instrument for their purposes. Socialism acquires a right only if war seems to have taken place between the two powers, the representatives of the old and the new, When, however, a wise calculation of the greatest possible preservation and advantageousness to both sides gives rise to a desire for a treaty. Without treaty, no right. So far, however, there is neither war nor treaty on the ground in question, therefore no rights, no ought. 447. Utilizing the most trivial dishonesty. The power of the press consists in the fact that every individual who ministers to it only feels himself bound and constrained to a very small extent. He usually expresses his opinion, but sometimes also does not express it in order to serve his party or the politics of his country or even himself. Such little faults of dishonesty, or perhaps only of a dishonest silence, are not hard to bear by the individual, but the consequences are extraordinary, because these little faults are committed by many at the same time. Each one says to himself, for such small concessions I live better and can make my income. By the want of such little compliances I make myself impossible. Because it seems almost morally indifferent to write a line more, perhaps even without signature, or not to write it, a person who has money and influence can make any opinion a public one. He who knows that most people are weak in trifles, and wishes to attain his own ends thereby, is always dangerous. 448. Too loud a tone in grievances. Through the fact that an account of a bad state of things, for instance, the crimes of an administration, bribery, and arbitrary favor in political or learned bodies, is greatly exaggerated, it fails in its effect on intelligent people, but has all the greater effect on the unintelligent, who would have remained indifferent to an accurate and moderate account. But as these latter are considerably in the majority, and harbor in themselves stronger will power and more impatient desire for action, the exaggeration becomes the cause of investigations, punishments, promises, and reorganizations. In so far, it is useful to exaggerate the accounts of bad states of things. 449. The apparent weather makers of politics. Just as people tacitly assume that he who understands the weather and foretells it about a day in advance makes the weather, so even the educated and learned, with a display of superstitious faith, ascribe to great statesmen as their most special work all the important changes and conjunctures that have taken place during their administration, when it is only evident that they knew something thereof a little earlier than other people and made their calculations accordingly. Thus they are also looked upon as weather makers, and this belief is not the least important instrument of their power. 450. New and old conceptions of government. To draw such a distinction between government and people, as if two separate spheres of power, a stronger and higher, and a weaker and lower, negotiated and came to terms with each other, is a remnant of transmitted political sentiment, which still accurately represents the historic establishment of the conditions of power in most states. When Bismarck, for instance, describes the constitutional system as a compromise between government and people, he speaks in accordance with a principle which has its reason in history, from whence, to be sure, it also derives its admixture of folly, without which nothing human can exist. On the other hand, we must now learn, in accordance with a principle which has originated only in the brain, and has still to make history, that government is nothing but an organ of the people, not an attentive, honorable higher, in relation to a lower accustomed to modesty. Before we accept this hitherto unhistorical and arbitrary, although logical formulation of the conception of government, let us but consider its consequences, for the relation between people and government is the strongest typical relation, after the pattern of which the relationship between teacher and pupil, master and servants, father and family, leader and soldier, master and apprentice is unconsciously formed. At present, under the influence of the prevailing constitutional system of government, all these relationships are changing a little. They are becoming compromises, but how they will have to be reversed and shifted and change name and nature, when that newest of all conceptions has got the upper hand everywhere in people's minds, to achieve which, however, a century may yet be required. In this matter there is nothing further to be wished for except caution and slow development. 451. Justice as the decoy cry of parties. Well may noble, if not exactly very intelligent, representatives of the governing classes asseverate, we will treat men equally and grant them equal rights. So far a socialistic mode of thought which is based on justice is possible, but, as has been said, only within the ranks of the governing class, which in this case practices justice with sacrifices and abnegations. On the other hand, to demand equality of rights, as do the socialists of the subject caste, is by no means the outcome of justice, but of covetousness. If you expose bloody pieces of flesh to a beast, and withdraw them again until it finally begins to roar, do you think that roaring implies justice? 452. Possession and justice. When the socialists point out that the division of property at the present day is the consequence of countless deeds of injustice and violence, and in summa repudiate obligation to anything with so unrighteous a basis, they only perceive something isolated. The entire past of ancient civilization is built up on violence, slavery, deception, and error. We, however, cannot annul ourselves the heirs of all these conditions, nay, the concrescences of all this past, and are not entitled to demand the withdrawal of a single fragment thereof. The unjust disposition lurks also in the souls of non-possessors. They are not better than the possessors, and have no moral prerogative, for at one time or another their ancestors have been possessors. Not forcible new distributions, but gradual transformations of opinion are necessary. Justice in all matters must become greater, the instinct of violence weaker. 453. The helmsman of the passions. The statesman excites public passions in order to have the advantage of the counter passions thereby aroused. To give an example, a German statesman knows quite well that the Catholic Church will never have the same plans as Russia; indeed, that it would far rather be allied with the Turk than with the former country. He likewise knows that Germany is threatened with great danger from an alliance between France and Russia. If he can succeed, therefore, in making France the focus and fortress of the Catholic Church, he has averted this danger for a lengthy period. He has accordingly an interest in showing hatred against the Catholics, in transforming, by all kinds of hostility, the supporters of the Pope's authority into an impassioned political power, which is opposed to German politics, and must, as a matter of course, coalesce with France as the adversary of Germany. His aim is the Catholicizing of France, just as necessarily as Mirabeau saw the salvation of his native land in de-Catholicizing it. The one state, therefore, desires to muddle millions of minds of another state in order to gain advantage thereby. It is the same disposition which supports the republican form of government of a neighboring state, le désordre organisé, as Mérimée says, for the sole reason that it assumes that this form of government makes the nation weaker, more distracted, less fit for war. 454. The dangerous revolutionary spirits. Those who are bent on revolutionizing society may be divided into those who seek something for themselves thereby, and those who seek something for their children and grandchildren. The latter are the more dangerous, for they have the belief and the good conscience of disinterestedness. The others can be appeased by favors. Those in power are still sufficiently rich and wise to adopt that expedient. The danger begins as soon as the aims become impersonal. Revolutionists seeking impersonal interests may consider all defenders of the present state of things as personally interested, and may therefore feel themselves superior to their opponents. 455. The political value of paternity. When a man has no sons, he has not a full right to join in a discussion concerning the needs of a particular community. A person must himself have staked his dearest object along with the others. That alone binds him fast to the state. He must have in view the well-being of his descendants, and must therefore, above all, have descendants in order to take a right and natural share in all institutions and the changes thereof. The development of higher morality depends on a person's having sons. It disposes him to be unegoistic, or, more correctly, it extends his egoism in its duration and permits him earnestly to strive after goals which lie beyond his individual lifetime. 456. Pride of descent. A man may be justly proud of an unbroken line of good ancestors down to his father, not, however, of the line itself, for every one has that descent from good ancestors constitutes the real nobility of birth. A single break in the chain, one bad ancestor, therefore destroys the nobility of birth. Every one who talks about his nobility should be asked, have you no violent, avaricious, dissolute, wicked, cruel man amongst your ancestors? If with good cognizance and conscience he can answer no, then let his friendship be sought. 457. Slaves and Laborers. The fact that we regard the gratification of vanity as of more account than all other forms of well-being, security, position, and pleasures of all sorts, is shown to a ludicrous extent by every one wishing for the abolition of slavery, and utterly abhorring to put any one into this position, apart altogether from political reasons, while every one must acknowledge to himself that in all respects slaves live more securely and more happily than modern laborers, and that slave labor is very easy labor compared with that of the laborer. We protest in the name of the dignity of man, but, expressed more simply, that is just our darling vanity, which feels non-equality and inferiority in public estimation to be the hardest lot of all. The cynic thinks differently concerning the matter, because he despises honor, and so Diogenes was for some time a slave and tutor. 458. Leading minds and their instruments. We see that great statesmen, and in general all who have to employ many people to carry out their plans, sometimes proceed one way and sometimes another. They either choose with great skill and care the people suitable for their plans, and then leave them a comparatively large amount of liberty, because they know that the nature of the person selected impels them precisely to the point where they themselves would have them go. Or else they choose badly, in fact take whatever comes to hand, but out of every piece of clay they form something useful for their purpose. These latter minds are the more high-handed. They also desire more submissive instruments. Their knowledge of mankind is usually much smaller, their contempt of mankind greater than in the case of the first mentioned class, but the machines they construct generally work better than the machines from the workshops of the former. 459. Arbitrary law necessary. Jurists dispute whether the most perfectly thought out law, or that which is most easily understood, should prevail in a nation. The former, the best model of which is Roman law, seems incomprehensible to the layman, and is therefore not the expression of his sense of justice. Popular laws, the Germanic for instance, have been rude, superstitious, illogical, and in part idiotic, but they represented very definite inherited national morals and sentiments. But whereas with us law is no longer custom, it can only command and be compulsion. None of us any longer possesses a traditional sense of justice. We must therefore content ourselves with arbitrary laws, which are the expressions of the necessity that there must be law. The most logical is then, in any case, the most acceptable, because it is the most impartial, granting even that in every case the smallest unit of measure in the relation of crime and punishment is arbitrarily fixed. 460. The great man of the masses. The recipe for what the masses call a great man is easily given. In all circumstances let a person provide them with something very pleasant, or first let him put it into their heads that this or that would be very pleasant, and then let him give it to them. On no account give it immediately, however, but let him acquire it by the greatest exertions, or seem thus to acquire it. The masses must have the impression that there is a powerful, nay, indomitable strength of will operating. At least it must seem to be there operating. Everybody admires a strong will because nobody possesses it, and everybody says to himself that if he did possess it, there would no longer be any bounds for him and his egoism. If, then, it becomes evident that such a strong will effects something very agreeable to the masses, instead of hearkening to the wishes of covetousness, people admire once more and wish good luck to themselves. Moreover, if he has all the qualities of the masses, they are the less ashamed before him, and he is all the more popular. Consequently, he may be violent, envious, rapacious, intriguing, flattering, fawning, inflated, and, according to circumstances, anything whatsoever. 461. Prince and God. People frequently commune with their princes in the same way as with their God, as indeed the prince himself was frequently the deity's representative, or at least his high priest. This almost uncanny disposition of veneration, disquiet, and shame grew and has grown much weaker, but occasionally it flares up again, and fastens upon powerful persons generally. The cult of genius is an echo of this veneration of gods and princes. Wherever an effort is made to exalt particular men to the superhuman, there is also a tendency to regard whole grades of the population as coarser and baser than they really are. 462. My Utopia. In a better arranged society, the heavy work and trouble of life will be assigned to those who suffer least through it, to the most obtuse, therefore, and so step by step up to those who are most sensitive to the highest and sublimest kinds of suffering, and who therefore still suffer notwithstanding the greatest alleviations of life. 463. A delusion in subversive doctrines. There are political and social dreamers who ardently and eloquently call for the overthrow of all order, in the belief that the proudest fane of beautiful humanity will then rear itself immediately, almost of its own accord. In these dangerous dreams there is still an echo of Rousseau's superstition, which believes in a marvelous primordial goodness of human nature, buried up, as it were, and lays all the blame of that bearing up on the institutions of civilization, on society, state, and education. Unfortunately, it is well known by historical experiences that every such overthrow reawakens into new life the wildest energies, the long buried horrors and extravagances of remotest ages, that an overthrow therefore may possibly be a source of strength to a deteriorated humanity, but never a regulator, architect, artist, or perfecter of human nature. It was not Voltaire's moderate nature inclined towards regulating, purifying, and reconstructing, but Rousseau's passionate follies and half lies that aroused the optimistic spirit of the Revolution, against which I cry, Écrasez l'infâme. Owing to this, the spirit of enlightenment and progressive development has been long scared away. Let us see, each of us individually, if it is not possible to recall it. 464. Moderation. When perfect resoluteness in thinking and investigating, that is to say, freedom of spirit, has become a feature of character, it produces moderation of conduct, for it weakens avidity, attracts much extant energy for the furtherance of intellectual aims, and shows the semi-usefulness or uselessness and danger of all sudden changes. 465. The resurrection of the spirit. A nation usually renews its youth on a political sick-bed, and there finds again the spirit which it had gradually lost in seeking and maintaining power. Culture is indebted most of all to politically weakened periods. 466. New opinions in the old home. The overthrow of opinions is not immediately followed by the overthrow of institutions. On the contrary, the new opinions dwell for a long time in the desolate and haunted house of their predecessors, and conserve it even for want of a habitation. 467. Public education. In large states, public education will always be extremely mediocre, for the same reason that in large kitchens the cooking is at best only mediocre. 468. Innocent corruption. In all institutions into which the sharp breeze of public criticism does not penetrate, an innocent corruption grows up like a fungus, for instance, in learned bodies and senates. 469. Scholars as politicians. To scholars who become politicians, the comic role is usually assigned. They have to be the good conscience of a state policy. 470. The wolf hidden behind the sheep. Almost every politician, in certain circumstances, has such need of an honest man that he breaks into the sheepfold like a famished wolf, not, however, to devour a stolen sheep, but to hide himself behind its woolly back. 471. Happy times. A happy age is no longer possible, because men only wish for it, but do not desire to have it. And each individual, when good days come for him, learns positively to pray for disquiet and misery. The destiny of mankind is arranged for happy moments. Every life has such, but not for happy times. Nevertheless, such times will continue to exist in man's imagination, as over the hills and far away, an heirloom of his earliest ancestors, for the idea of the happy age, from the earliest times to the present, has no doubt been derived from the state in which man, after violent exertions in hunting and warfare, gives himself over to repose, stretches out his limbs, and hears the wings of sleep rustle around him. It is a false conclusion, when, in accordance with that old habit, man imagines that after whole periods of distress and trouble, he will be able also to enjoy the state of happiness in proportionate increase and duration. End of Division 8, Part 1. Division 8, Part 2 of Human, All Too Human, a book for free spirits by Friedrich Nietzsche, translated by Helen Zimmern. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 8th Division, A Glance at the State, Part 2. 472. Religion and Government. So long as the state, or more properly the government, regards itself as the appointed guardian of a number of minors, and on their account considers the question whether religion should be preserved or abolished, it is highly probable that it will always decide for the preservation thereof. For religion satisfies the nature of the individual in times of loss, destitution, terror, and distrust. In cases, therefore, where the government feels itself incapable of doing anything directly for the mitigation of the spiritual sufferings of the individual, indeed, even in general, unavoidable, and next to inevitable evils, famines, financial crises, and wars, religion gives to the masses an attitude of tranquillity and confiding expectancy. Whenever the necessary or accidental deficiencies of the state government, or the dangerous consequences of dynastic interests, strike the eyes of the intelligent and make them refractory, the unintelligent will only think they see the finger of God therein, and will submit with patience to the dispensations from on high, a conception in which divine and human modes of government usually coalesce. Thus internal civil peace and continuity of development will be preserved. The power which lies in the unity of popular feeling, in the existence of the same opinions and aims for all, is protected and confirmed by religion. The rare cases excepted, in which a priesthood cannot agree with the state about the price, and therefore comes into conflict with it. As a rule, the state will know how to win over the priests, because it needs their most private and secret system for educating souls, and knows how to value servants who apparently and outwardly represent quite other interests. Even at present, no power can become legitimate without the assistance of the priests, a fact which Napoleon understood. Thus, absolutely paternal government and the careful preservation of religion necessarily go hand in hand. In this connection, it must be taken for granted that the rulers and governing classes are enlightened concerning the advantages which religion affords, and consequently feel themselves to a certain extent superior to it, inasmuch as they use it as a means. Thus freedom of spirit has its origin here. But how will it be when the totally different interpretation of the idea of government, such as is taught in democratic states, begins to prevail? When one sees in it nothing but the instrument of the popular will, no upper in contrast to an under, but merely a function of the sole sovereign, the people. Here also only the same attitude which the people assume towards religion can be assumed by the government. Every diffusion of enlightenment will have to find an echo even in the representatives, and the utilizing and exploiting of religious impulses and consolations for state purposes will not be so easy, unless powerful party leaders occasionally exercise an influence resembling that of enlightened despotism. When, however, the state is not permitted to derive any further advantage from religion, or when people think far too variously on religious matters to allow the state to adopt a consistent and uniform procedure with respect to them, the way out of the difficulty will necessarily present itself, namely to treat religion as a private affair, and leave it to the conscience and custom of each single individual. The first result of all is that religious feeling seems to be strengthened, inasmuch as hidden and suppressed impulses thereof, which the state had unintentionally or intentionally stifled, now break forth and rush to extremes. Later on, however, it is found that religion is overgrown with sects, and that an abundance of dragons' teeth were sown as soon as religion was made a private affair. The spectacle of strife and the hostile laying bare of all the weaknesses of religious confessions admit finally of no other expedient, except that every better and more talented person should make irreligiousness his private affair, a sentiment which now obtains the upper hand even in the minds of the governing classes, and almost against their will gives an anti-religious character to their measures. As soon as this happens, the sentiment of persons still religiously disposed, who formerly adored the state as something half sacred or wholly sacred, changes into decided hostility to the state. They lie in wait for governmental measures, seeking to hinder, thwart, and disturb as much as they can, and by the fury of their contradiction drive the opposing parties, the irreligious ones, into an almost fanatical enthusiasm for the state, in connection with which there is also the silently cooperating influence that since their separation from religion the hearts of persons in these circles are conscious of a void, and seek by devotion to the state to provide themselves provisionally with a substitute for religion, a kind of stuffing for the void. After these, perhaps lengthy transitional struggles, it is finally decided whether the religious parties are still strong enough to revive an old condition of things and turn the wheel backwards, in which case enlightened despotism, perhaps less enlightened and more timorous than formerly, inevitably gets the state into its hands, or whether the non-religious parties achieve their purpose, and possibly through schools and education check the increase of their opponents during several generations, and finally make them no longer possible. Then, however, their enthusiasm for the state also abates. It always becomes more obvious that along with the religious adoration, which regards the state as a mystery and a supernatural institution, the reverent and pious relation to it has also been convulsed. Henceforth individuals see only that side of the state which may be useful or injurious to them, and press forward by all means to obtain an influence over it. But this rivalry soon becomes too great. Men and parties change too rapidly, and throw each other down again too furiously from the mountain when they have only just succeeded in getting aloft. All the measures which such a government carries out lack the guarantee of permanence. People then fight shy of undertakings which would require the silent growth of future decades or centuries to produce ripe fruit. Nobody henceforth feels any other obligation to a law than to submit for the moment to the power which introduced the law. People immediately set to work, however, to undermine it by a new power, a newly formed majority. Finally, it may be confidently asserted, the distrust of all government, the insight into the useless and harassing nature of these short-winded struggles must drive men to an entirely new resolution, to the abrogation of the conception of the state and the abolition of the contrast of private and public. Private concerns gradually absorb the business of the state. Even the toughest residue which is left over from the old work of governing, the business, for instance, which is meant to protect private persons from private persons, will at last some day be managed by private enterprise. The neglect, decline, and death of the state, the liberation of the private person, I'm careful not to say the individual, are the consequences of the democratic conception of the state. That is its mission. When it has accomplished its task, which, like everything human, involves much rationality and irrationality, and when all relapses into the old malady have been overcome, then a new leaf in the storybook of humanity will be unrolled, on which readers will find all kinds of strange tales, and perhaps also some amount of good. To repeat shortly what has been said, the interests of the tutelary government and the interests of religion go hand in hand, so that when the latter begins to decay, the foundations of the state are also shaken. The belief in a divine regulation of political affairs, in a mystery, in the existence of the state, is of religious origin. If religion disappears, the state will inevitably lose its old veil of Isis, and will no longer arouse veneration. The sovereignty of the people, looked at closely, serves also to dispel the final fascination and superstition in the realm of these sentiments. Modern democracy is the historical form of the decay of the state. The outlook which results from this certain decay is not, however, unfortunate in every respect. The wisdom and the selfishness of men are the best developed of all their qualities. When the state no longer meets the demands of these impulses, chaos will least of all result, but a still more appropriate expedient than the state will get the mastery over the state. How man-organizing forces have already been seen to die out, for example, that of the gens or clan, which for millennia was far mightier than the power of the family, and indeed already ruled and regulated long before the latter existed. We ourselves see the important notions of the right and might of the family, which once possessed the supremacy, as far as the Roman system extended, always becoming paler and feebler. In the same way, a later generation will also see the state become meaningless in certain parts of the world, an idea which many contemporaries can hardly contemplate without alarm and horror. To labor for the propagation and realization of this idea is certainly another thing. One must think very presumptuously of one's reason, and only half understand history to set one's hand to the plough at present, when as yet no one can show us the seeds that are afterwards to be sown upon the broken soil. Let us therefore trust to the wisdom and selfishness of men, that the state may yet exist a good while longer, and that the destructive attempts of overzealous, too hasty zealists may be in vain. 473. Socialism with regard to its means. Socialism is the fantastic younger brother of almost decrepit despotism, which it wants to succeed. Its efforts are therefore in the deepest sense reactionary, for it desires such an amount of state power as only despotism has possessed. Indeed, it outdoes all the past, in that it aims at the complete annihilation of the individual, whom it deems an unauthorized luxury of nature, which is to be improved by it into an appropriate organ of the general community. Owing to its relationship, it always appears in proximity to excessive developments of power, like the old typical socialist Plato at the court of the Sicilian tyrant. It desires, and under certain circumstances furthers, the Caesarian despotism of this century, because, as has been said, it would like to become its heir. But even this inheritance would not suffice for its objects. It requires the most submissive prostration of all citizens before the absolute state, such as has never yet been realized, and as it can no longer even count upon the old religious piety towards the state, but must rather strive involuntarily and continuously for the abolition thereof, because it strives for the abolition of all existing states, it can only hope for existence occasionally, here and there, for short periods, by means of the extremest terrorism. It is therefore silently preparing itself for reigns of terror, and drives the word justice like a nail into the heads of the half-cultured masses, in order to deprive them completely of their understanding, after they had already suffered seriously from the half-culture, and to provide them with a good conscience for the bad game they are to play. Socialism may serve to teach, very brutally and impressively, the danger of all accumulations of state power. It may serve so far to inspire distrust of the state itself. When its rough voice strikes up the war cry, as much state as possible, the shout at first becomes louder than ever, but soon the opposition cry also breaks forth with so much greater force, as little state as possible. 474. The development of the mind, feared by the state. The Greek polis was, like every organizing political power, exclusive and distrustful of the growth of culture. Its powerful fundamental impulse seemed almost solely to have a paralyzing and obstructive effect thereon. It did not want to let any history or any becoming have a place in culture. The education laid down in the state laws was meant to be obligatory on all generations, to keep them at one stage of development. Plato also, later on, did not desire it to be otherwise in his ideal state. In spite of the polis, culture developed itself in this manner. Indirectly, to be sure, and against its will, the polis furnished assistance, because the ambition of individuals therein was stimulated to the utmost, so that, having once found the path of intellectual development, they followed it to its farthest extremity. On the other hand, appeal should not be made to the panegyric of Pericles, for it is only a great optimistic dream about the alleged necessary connection between the polis and Athenian culture. Immediately before the night fell over Athens, the plague and the breakdown of tradition, Thucydides makes this culture flash up once more like of the evil day that had preceded. 475. European man and the destruction of nationalities. Commerce and industry, interchange of books and letters, the universality of all higher culture, the rapid changing of locality and landscape, and the present nomadic life of all who are not landowners, these circumstances necessarily bring with them a weakening, and finally a destruction of nationalities, at least of European nationalities, so that in consequence of perpetual crossings there must arise out of them all a mixed race, that of the European man. At present the isolation of nations through the rise of national enmities, consciously or unconsciously, counteracts this tendency. But nevertheless the process of fusing advances slowly, in spite of those occasional countercurrents. This artificial nationalism is, however, as dangerous as was artificial Catholicism, for it is essentially an unnatural condition of extremity, and martial law which has been proclaimed by the few over the many, and requires artifice, lying, and force to maintain its reputation. It is not the interests of the many of the peoples, as they probably say, but it is first of all the interests of certain princely dynasties, and then of certain commercial and social classes, which impel to this nationalism. Once we have recognized this fact, we should just fearlessly style ourselves good Europeans, and labor actively for the amalgamation of nations, in which efforts Germans may assist by virtue of their hereditary position as interpreters and intermediaries between nations. By the way, the great problem of the Jews only exists within the national states, inasmuch as their energy and higher intelligence, their intellectual and volitional capital, accumulated from generation to generation in tedious schools of suffering, must necessarily attain to universal supremacy here to an extent provocative of envy and hatred; so that the literary misconduct is becoming prevalent in almost all modern nations, and all the more so as they again set up to be national, of sacrificing the Jews as the scapegoats of all possible public and private abuses. So soon as it is no longer a question of the preservation or establishment of nations, but of the production and training of a European mixed race of the greatest possible strength, the Jew is just as useful and desirable an ingredient as any other national remnant. Every nation, every individual has unpleasant and even dangerous qualities. It is cruel to require that the Jew should be an exception. Those qualities may even be dangerous and frightful in a special degree in his case, and perhaps the young Stock Exchange Jew is in general the most repulsive invention of the human species. Nevertheless, in a general summing up, I should like to know how much must be excused in a nation which, not without blame on the part of all of us, has had the most mournful history of all nations, and to which we owe the most loving of men, Christ, the most upright of sages, Spinoza, the mightiest book and the most effective moral law in the world. Moreover, in the darkest times of the Middle Ages, when Asiatic clouds had gathered darkly over Europe, it was Jewish freethinkers, scholars, and physicians who upheld the banner of enlightenment and of intellectual independence under the severest personal sufferings, and defended Europe against Asia. We owe it not least to their efforts that a more natural, more reasonable, at all events unmythical explanation of the world was finally able to get the upper hand once more, and that the link of culture, which now unites us with the enlightenment of Graeco-Roman antiquity, has remained unbroken. If Christianity has done everything to orientalize the Occident, Judaism has assisted essentially in occidentalizing it anew, which in a certain sense is equivalent to making Europe's mission and history a continuation of that of Greece. 476. Apparent superiority of the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages present in the Church an institution with an absolutely universal aim, involving the whole of humanity, an aim, moreover, which, presumably, concerned man's highest interests. In comparison therewith, the aims of the states and nations which modern history exhibits make a painful impression. They seem petty, base, material, and restricted in extent. But this different impression on our imagination should certainly not determine our judgment, for that universal institution corresponded to feigned and fictitiously fostered needs, such as the need of salvation, which, wherever they did not already exist, it had first of all to create. The new institutions, however, relieve actual distresses, and the time is coming when institutions will arise to minister to the common, genuine needs of all men, and to cast that fantastic prototype, the Catholic Church, into shade and oblivion. 477. War indispensable. It is nothing but fanaticism and beautiful soulism to expect very much, or even much only, from humanity when it has forgotten how to wage war. For the present we know of no other means whereby the rough energy of the camp, the deep impersonal hatred, the cold-bloodedness of murder with a good conscience, the general ardor of the system in the destruction of the enemy, the proud indifference to great losses, to one's own existence and that of one's friends, the hollow earthquake-like convulsion of the soul, can be as forcibly and certainly communicated to enervated nations as is done by every great war, owing to the brooks and streams that here break forth, which certainly sweep stones and rubbish of all sorts along with them, and destroy the meadows of delicate cultures. The mechanism in the workshops of the mind is afterwards, in favorable circumstances, rotated by new power. Culture can by no means dispense with passions, vices, and malignities. When the Romans, after having become imperial, had grown rather tired of war, they attempted to gain new strength by beast baitings, gladiatorial combats, and Christian persecutions. The English of today, who appear on the whole to have also renounced war, adopt other means in order to generate anew those vanishing forces, namely the dangerous exploring expeditions, sea voyages, and mountaineerings, nominally undertaken for scientific purposes, but in reality to bring home surplus strength from adventures and dangers of all kinds. Many other such substitutes for war will be discovered, but perhaps precisely thereby it will become more and more obvious that such a highly cultivated and therefore necessarily enfeebled humanity as that of modern Europe not only needs wars, but the greatest and most terrible wars, consequently occasional relapses into barbarism, lest by the means of culture it should lose its culture and its very existence. 478. Industry in the South and the North. Industry arises in two entirely different ways. The artisans of the South are not industrious because of acquisitiveness, but because of the constant needs of others. The smith is industrious because someone is always coming who wants a horse shod or a carriage mended. If nobody came, he would loiter about in the marketplace. In a fruitful land, he has little trouble in supporting himself. For that purpose he requires only a very small amount of work, certainly no industry. Eventually he would beg and be contented. The industry of English workmen, on the contrary, has acquisitiveness behind it. It is conscious of itself and its aims. With property it wants power, and with power the greatest possible liberty and individual distinction. 479. Wealth as the origin of a nobility of race. Wealth necessarily creates an aristocracy of race, for it permits the choice of the most beautiful women and the engagement of the best teachers. It allows a man cleanliness, time for physical exercises, and above all, immunity from dulling physical labor. So far it provides all the conditions for making man, after a few generations, move and even act nobly and handsomely. Greater freedom of character and absence of niggardliness, of wretchedly petty matters, and of abasement before bread-givers. It is precisely these negative qualities which are the most profitable birthday gift, that of happiness, for the young man. A person who is quite poor usually comes to grief through nobility of disposition. He does not get on, and acquires nothing. His race is not capable of living. In this connection, however, it must be remembered that wealth produces almost the same effects, whether one have $300,000 or $30,000 a year. There is no further essential progression of the favorable conditions afterwards. But to have less, to beg in boyhood, and to abase oneself is terrible, although it may be the proper starting point for such as seek their happiness in the splendor of courts, in subordination to the mighty and influential, or for such as wish to be heads of the church. It teaches how to slink crouching into the underground passages to favor. 480. Envy and inertia in different courses. The two opposing parties, the Socialist and the National, or whatever they may be called in the different countries of Europe, are worthy of each other. Envy and laziness are the motive powers in each of them. In the one camp they desire to work as little as possible with their hands, in the other as little as possible with their heads. In the latter they hate and envy prominent, self-evolving individuals who do not willingly allow themselves to be drawn up in rank and file for the purpose of a collective effect. In the former they hate and envy the better social caste, which is more favorably circumstanced outwardly, whose peculiar mission, the production of the highest blessings of culture, makes life inwardly all the harder and more painful. Certainly, if it be possible to make the spirit of the collective effect the spirit of the higher classes of society, the Socialist crowds are quite right when they also seek outward equalization between themselves and these classes, since they are certainly internally equalized with one another already in head and heart. Live as higher men, and always do the deeds of higher culture. Thus everything that lives will acknowledge your right, and the order of society, whose summit ye are, will be safe from every evil glance and attack. 481. High politics and their detriments. Just as a nation does not suffer the greatest losses that war and readiness for war involve through the expenses of the war, or the stoppage of trade and traffic, or through the maintenance of a standing army, however great these losses may now be, when 8 European states expend yearly the sum of 5 millions of marks thereon. But owing to the fact that year after year its ablest, strongest, and most industrious men are withdrawn in extraordinary numbers from their proper occupations and callings, to be turned into soldiers. In the same way, a nation that sets about practicing high politics and securing a decisive voice among the great powers does not suffer its greatest losses where they are usually supposed to be. In fact, from this time onward, it constantly sacrifices a number of its most conspicuous talents upon the altar of the fatherland, or of national ambition, whilst formerly other spheres of activity were open to those talents which are now swallowed up by politics. But apart from these public hecatombs, and in reality much more horrible, there is a drama which is constantly being performed simultaneously in 100,000 acts. Every able, industrious, intellectually striving man of a nation that thus covets political laurels is swayed by this covetousness, and no longer belongs entirely to himself alone, as he did formerly. The new daily questions and cares of the public welfare devour a daily tribute of the intellectual and emotional capital of every citizen. The sum of all these sacrifices and losses of individual energy and labor is so enormous that the political growth of a nation almost necessarily entails an intellectual impoverishment and lassitude, a diminished capacity for the performance of works that require great concentration and specialization. The question may finally be asked, does it then pay, all this bloom and magnificence of the total, which indeed only manifests itself as the fear of the new Colossus in other nations, and as the compulsory favoring by them of national trade and commerce, when all the nobler, finer, and more intellectual plants and products in which its soil was hitherto so rich must be sacrificed to this coarse and opalescent flower of the nation. 482. Repeated once more. Public opinion, private laziness. End of Division 8, Part 2. Division 9, Part 1 of Human, All Too Human, a book for free spirits by Friedrich Nietzsche, translated by Helen Zimmern. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Ninth Division, Part 1, Man Alone by Himself. 483. The enemies of truth. Convictions are more dangerous enemies of truth than lies. 484. A topsy-turvy world. We criticize a thinker more severely when he puts an unpleasant statement before us, and yet it would be more reasonable to do so when we find his statement pleasant. 485. Decided character. A man far oftener appears to have a decided character from persistently following his temperament than from persistently following his principles. 486. The one thing needful. One thing a man must have, either a naturally light disposition or a disposition lightened by art and knowledge. 487. The passion for things. Whoever sets his passion on things, sciences, arts, the common weal, the interests of culture, withdraws much fervor from his passion for persons, even when they are the representatives of those things, as statesmen, philosophers, and artists are the representatives of their creations. 488. Calmness in action. As a cascade in its descent becomes more deliberate and suspended, so the great man of action usually acts with more calmness than his strong passions previous to action would lead one to expect. 489. Not too deep. Persons who grasp a matter in all its depth seldom remain permanently true to it. They have just brought the depth up into the light, and there is always much evil to be seen there. 490. The illusion of idealists. All idealists imagine that the cause which they serve is essentially better than all other causes, and will not believe that if their cause is really to flourish, it requires precisely the same evil-smelling manure which all other human undertakings have need of. 491. Self-observation. Man is exceedingly well protected from himself, and guarded against his self-exploring and self-besieging. As a rule, he can perceive nothing of himself but his outworks. The actual fortress is inaccessible and even invisible to him, unless friends and enemies become traitors and lead him inside by secret paths. 492. The right calling. Men can seldom hold on to a calling unless they believe or persuade themselves that it is really more important than any other. Women are the same with their lovers. 493. Nobility of disposition. Nobility of disposition consists largely in good nature and absence of distrust, and therefore contains precisely that upon which money-grabbing and successful men take a pleasure in walking with superiority and scorn. 494. Goal and path. Many are obstinate with regard to the once chosen path, few with regard to the goal. 495. The offensiveness in an individual way of life. All specially individual lines of conduct excite irritation against him who adopts them. People feel themselves reduced to the level of commonplace creatures by the extraordinary treatment he bestows on himself. 496. The privilege of greatness. It is the privilege of greatness to confer intense happiness with insignificant gifts. 497. Unintentionally noble. A person behaves with unintentional nobleness when he has accustomed himself to seek naught from others and always to give to them. 498. A condition of heroism. When a person wishes to become a hero, the serpent must previously have become a dragon, otherwise he lacks his proper enemy. 499. Friends. Fellowship in joy, and not sympathy in sorrow, makes people friends. 500. Making use of ebb and flow. For the purpose of knowledge, we must know how to make use of the inward current which draws us towards a thing, and also of the current which after a time draws us away from it. 501. Joy in itself. Joy in the thing, people say, but in reality it is joy in itself by means of the thing. 502. The unassuming man. He who is unassuming towards persons manifests his presumption, all the more with regard to things, town, state, society, time, humanity. That is his revenge. 503. Envy and jealousy. Envy and jealousy are the pudenda of the human soul. The comparison may perhaps be carried further. 504. The noblest hypocrite. It is a very noble hypocrisy not to talk of oneself at all. 505. Vexation. Vexation is a physical disease which is not by any means cured when its cause is subsequently removed. 506. The champions of truth. Truth does not find fewest champions when it is dangerous to speak it, but when it is dull. 507. More troublesome even than enemies. Persons of whose sympathetic attitude we are not, in all circumstances, convinced, while for some reason or other, gratitude for instance, we are obliged to maintain the appearance of unqualified sympathy with them, trouble our imagination far more than our enemies do. 508. Free nature. We are so fond of being out among nature, because it has no opinions about us. 509. Each superior in one thing. In civilized intercourse, everyone feels himself superior to all others in at least one thing. Kindly feelings generally are based thereon, inasmuch as everyone can, in certain circumstances, render help, and is therefore entitled to accept help without shame. 510. Consolatory arguments. In the case of a death, we mostly use consolatory arguments, not so much to alleviate the grief as to make excuses for feeling so easily consoled. 511. Persons loyal to their convictions. Whoever is very busy retains his general views and opinions almost unchanged. So also does every one who labors in the service of an idea. He will never more examine the idea itself. He no longer has any time to do so. Indeed, it is against his interest to consider it as still admitting of discussion. 512. Morality and quantity. The higher morality of one man as compared with that of another often lies merely in the fact that his aims are quantitatively greater. The other, living in a circumscribed sphere, is dragged down by petty occupations. 513. The life as the proceeds of life. A man may stretch himself out ever so far with his knowledge, he may seem to himself ever so objective, but eventually he realizes nothing therefrom but his own biography. 514. Iron necessity. Iron necessity is a thing which has been found in the course of history to be neither iron nor necessary. 515. From experience. The unreasonableness of a thing is no argument against its existence, but rather a condition thereof. 516. Truth. Nobody dies nowadays of fatal truths. There are too many antidotes to them. 517. A fundamental insight. There is no pre-established harmony between the promotion of truth and the welfare of mankind. 518. Man's lot. He who thinks most deeply knows that he is always in the wrong, however he may act and decide. 519. Truth as Circe. Error has made animals into men. Is truth perhaps capable of making man into an animal again? 520. The danger of our culture. We belong to a period of which the culture is in danger of being destroyed by the appliances of culture. 521. Greatness means leading the way. No stream is large and copious of itself, but becomes great by receiving and leading on so many tributary streams. It is so also with all intellectual greatnesses. It is only a question of someone indicating the direction to be followed by so many affluents, not whether he was richly or poorly gifted originally. 522. A feeble conscience. People who talk about their importance to mankind have a feeble conscience for common bourgeois rectitude, keeping of contracts, promises, etc. 523. Desiring to be loved. The demand to be loved is the greatest of presumptions. 524. Contempt for men. The most unequivocal sign of contempt for man is to regard everybody merely as a means to one's own ends, or of no account whatever. 525. Partisans through contradiction. Whoever has driven men to fury against himself has also gained a party in his favor. 526. Forgetting experiences. Whoever thinks much and to good purpose easily forgets his own experiences, but not the thoughts which these experiences have called forth. 527. Sticking to an opinion. One person sticks to an opinion because he takes pride in having acquired it himself. Another sticks to it because he has learnt it with difficulty and is proud of having understood it, both of them therefore out of vanity. 528. Avoiding the light. Good deeds avoid the light just as anxiously as evil deeds. The latter fear that pain will result from publicity as punishment, the former fear that pleasure will vanish with publicity, the pure pleasure per se, which ceases as soon as satisfaction of vanity is added to it. 529. The length of the day. When one has much to put into them, a day has 100 pockets. 530. The genius of tyranny. When an invincible desire to obtain tyrannical power has been awakened in the soul and constantly keeps up its fervor, even a very mediocre talent in politicians, artists, etc., gradually becomes an almost irresistible natural force. 531. The enemy's life. He who lives by fighting with an enemy has an interest in the preservation of the enemy's life. 532. More important. Unexplained, obscure matters are regarded as more important than explained, clear ones. 533. Valuation of services rendered. We estimate services rendered to us according to the value set on them by those who render them, not according to the value they have for us. 534. Unhappiness. The distinction associated with unhappiness, as if it were a sign of stupidity, unambitiousness, or commonplaceness to feel happy, is so great that when any one says to us, "How happy you are," we usually protest. 535. Imagination in anguish. When one is afraid of anything, one's imagination plays the part of that evil spirit which springs on one's back just when one has the heaviest load to bear. 536. The value of insipid opponents. We sometimes remain faithful to a cause merely because its opponents never cease to be insipid. 537. The value of a profession. A profession makes us thoughtless. That is its greatest blessing, for it is a bulwark behind which we are permitted to withdraw when commonplace doubts and cares assail us. 538. Talent. Many a man's talent appears less than it is because he has always set himself too heavy tasks. 539. Youth. Youth is an unpleasant period, for then it is not possible or not prudent to be productive in any sense whatsoever. 540. Two great aims. Whoever aims publicly at great things, and at length perceives secretly that he is too weak to achieve them, has usually also insufficient strength to renounce his aims publicly, and then inevitably becomes a hypocrite. 541. In the current. Mighty waters sweep many stones and shrubs away with them. mighty spirits, many foolish and confused minds. 542. The dangers of intellectual emancipation. In a seriously intended intellectual emancipation, a person's mute passions and cravings also hope to find their advantage. 543. The incarnation of the mind. When anyone thinks much and to good purpose, not only his face but also his body acquires a sage look. 544. Seeing badly and hearing badly. The man who sees little always sees less than there is to see. The man who hears badly always hears something more than there is to hear. 545. Self-enjoyment in vanity. The vain man does not wish so much to be prominent as to feel himself prominent. He therefore disdains none of the expedients for self-deception and self-outwitting. It is not the opinion of others that he sets his heart on, but his opinion of their opinion. 546. Exceptionally vain. He who is usually self-sufficient becomes exceptionally vain, and keenly alive to fame and praise when he is physically ill. The more he loses himself, the more he has to endeavor to regain his position by means of the opinion of others. 547. The witty. Those who seek wit do not possess it. 548. A hint to the heads of parties. When one can make people publicly support a cause, they have also generally been brought to the point of inwardly declaring themselves in its favor, because they wish to be regarded as consistent. 549. Contempt. Man is more sensitive to the contempt of others than to self-contempt. 550. The tie of gratitude. There are servile souls who carry so far their sense of obligation for benefits received that they strangle themselves with the tie of gratitude. 551. The prophet's knack. In predicting beforehand the procedure of ordinary individuals, it must be taken for granted that they always make use of the smallest intellectual expenditure in freeing themselves from disagreeable situations. 552. Man's sole right. He who swerves from the traditional is a victim of the unusual. He who keeps to the traditional is its slave. The man is ruined in either case. 553. Below the beasts. When a man roars with laughter, he surpasses all the animals by his vulgarity. 554. Partial knowledge. He who speaks a foreign language imperfectly has more enjoyment therein than he who speaks it well. The enjoyment is with the partially initiated. 555. Dangerous helpfulness. There are people who wish to make human life harder for no other reason than to be able afterwards to offer men their life alleviating recipes. Their Christianity, for example. 556. Industriousness and conscientiousness. Industriousness and conscientiousness are often antagonists, owing to the fact that industriousness wants to pluck the fruit sour from the tree, while conscientiousness wants to let it hang too long until it falls and is bruised. 557. Casting suspicion. We endeavor to cast suspicion on persons whom we cannot endure. 558. The conditions are lacking. Many people wait all their lives for the opportunity to be good in their own way. 559. Lack of friends. Lack of friends leads to the inference that a person is envious or presumptuous. Many a man owes his friends merely to the fortunate circumstance that he has no occasion for envy. 560. Danger in manifoldness. With one talent more, we often stand less firmly than with one less, just as a table stands better on 3 feet than on 4. 561. An exemplar for others. Whoever wants to set a good example must add a grain of folly to his virtue. People then imitate their exemplar, and at the same time raise themselves above him, a thing they love to do. 562. Being a target. The bad things others say about us are often not really aimed at us, but are the manifestations of spite or ill humor, occasioned by quite different causes. 563. Easily resigned. We suffer but little on account of ungratified wishes if we have exercised our imagination in distorting the past. 564. In danger. One is in greatest danger of being run over when one has just got out of the way of a carriage. 565. The role according to the voice. Whoever is obliged to speak louder than he naturally does, say to a partially deaf person or before a large audience, usually exaggerates what he has to communicate. Many a one becomes a conspirator, malevolent gossip or intriguer, merely because his voice is best suited for whispering. 566. Love and hatred. Love and hatred are not blind, but are dazzled by the fire which they carry about with them. 567. Advantageously persecuted. People who cannot make their merits perfectly obvious to the world endeavor to awaken a strong hostility against themselves. They have then the consolation of thinking that this hostility stands between their merits and the acknowledgment thereof, and that many others think the same thing, which is very advantageous for their recognition. 568. Confession. We forget our fault when we have confessed it to another person, but he does not generally forget it. 569. Self-sufficiency. The golden fleece of self-sufficiency is a protection against blows, but not against needle pricks. 570. Shadows in the flame. The flame is not so bright to itself as to those whom it illuminates, so also the wise man. 571. Our own opinions. The first opinion that occurs to us when we are suddenly asked about anything is not usually our own, but only the current opinion belonging to our caste, position, or family. Our own opinions seldom float on the surface. 572. The origin of courage. The ordinary man is as courageous and invulnerable as a hero when he does not see the danger, when he has no eyes for it. Reversely, the hero has his own vulnerable spot upon the back, where he has no eyes. 573. The danger in the physician. One must be born for one's physician, otherwise one comes to grief through him. 574. Marvelous vanity. Whoever has courageously prophesied the weather 3 times and has been successful in his hits acquires a certain amount of inward confidence in his prophetic gift. We give credence to the marvelous and irrational when it flatters our self-esteem. 575. A profession. A profession is the backbone of life. 576. The danger of personal influence. Whoever feels that he exercises a great inward influence over another person must give him a perfectly free rein, must in fact welcome and even induce occasional opposition, otherwise he will inevitably make an enemy. 577. Recognition of the heir. Whoever has founded something great in an unselfish spirit is careful to rear heirs for his work. It is the sign of a tyrannical and ignoble nature to see opponents in all possible heirs, and to live in a state of self-defense against them. 578. Partial knowledge. Partial knowledge is more triumphant than complete knowledge. It takes things to be simpler than they are, and so makes its theory more popular and convincing. 579. Unsuitable for a party man. Whoever thinks much is unsuitable for a party man. His thinking leads him too quickly beyond the party. 580. A bad memory. The advantage of a bad memory is that one enjoys several times the same good things for the first time. 581. Self-affliction. Want of consideration is often the sign of a discordant inner nature which craves for stupefaction. 582. Martyrs. The disciples of a martyr suffer more than the martyr. 583. Arrears of vanity. The vanity of many people who have no occasion to be vain is the inveterate habit, still surviving from the time when people had no right to the belief in themselves and only begged it in small sums from others. 584. Punctum saliens of passion. A person falling into a rage or into a violent passion of love reaches a point when the soul is full like a hogshead, but nevertheless a drop of water has still to be added, the good will for the passion, which is also generally called the evil will. This item only is necessary, and then the hogshead overflows. 585. A gloomy thought. It is with men as with the charcoal fires in the forest. It is only when young men have cooled down and have got charred like these piles that they become useful. As long as they fume and smoke they are perhaps more interesting, but they are useless and too often uncomfortable. Humanity ruthlessly uses every individual as material for the heating of its great machines. But what then is the purpose of the machines, when all individuals, that is, the human race, are useful only to maintain them? Machines that are ends in themselves. Is that the Humana Commedia? 586. The hour hand of life. Life consists of rare single moments of the greatest importance, and of countless intervals during which at best the phantoms of those moments hover around us. Love, the spring, every fine melody, the mountains, the moon, the sea, All speak but once fully to the heart, if indeed they ever do quite attain to speech, for many people have not those moments at all, and are themselves intervals and pauses in the symphony of actual life. 587. Attack or compromise. We often make the mistake of showing violent enmity towards a tendency, party, or period, because we happen only to get a sight of its most exposed side, its stuntedness, or the inevitable faults of its virtues, perhaps because we ourselves have taken a prominent part in them. We then turn our backs on them and seek a diametrically opposite course. But the better way would be to seek out their strong good sides, or to develop them in ourselves. To be sure, a keener glance and a better will are needed to improve the becoming and the imperfect than are required to see through it in its imperfection and to deny it. 588. Modesty. There is true modesty, that is the knowledge that we are not the works we create, and it is especially becoming in a great mind, because such a mind can well grasp the thought of absolute irresponsibility, even for the good it creates. People do not hate a great man's presumptuousness, in so far as he feels his strength, but because he wishes to prove it by injuring others, by dominating them, and seeing how long they will stand it. This, as a rule, is even a proof of the absence of a secure sense of power, and makes people doubt his greatness. We must therefore beware of presumption from the standpoint of wisdom. 589. The day's first thought. The best way to begin a day well is to think, on awaking, whether we cannot give pleasure during the day to at least one person. If this could become a substitute for the religious habit of prayer, our fellow men would benefit by the change. 590. Presumption as the last consolation. When we so interpret a misfortune, an intellectual defect or disease, that we see therein our predestined fate, our trial, or the mysterious punishment of our former misdeeds, we thereby make our nature interesting, and exalt ourselves in imagination above our fellows. The proud sinner is a well-known figure in all religious sects. 591. The vegetation of happiness. Close beside the world's woe, and often upon its volcanic soil, man has laid out his little garden of happiness. Whether one regard life with the eyes of him who only seeks knowledge therefrom, or of him who submits and is resigned, or of him who rejoices over surmounted difficulties, everywhere one will find some happiness springing up beside the evil. And in fact always the more happiness, the more volcanic the soil has been, only it would be absurd to say that suffering itself is justified by this happiness. 592. The path of our ancestors. It is sensible when a person develops still further in himself the talent upon which his father or grandfather spent much trouble, and does not shift to something entirely new. Otherwise he deprives himself of the possibility of attaining perfection in any one craft. That is why the proverb says, "Which road shouldst thou ride? That of thine ancestors." 593. Vanity and ambition as educators. As long as a person has not become an instrument of general utility, ambition may torment him. If, however, that point has been reached, if he necessarily works like a machine for the good of all, then vanity may result. It will humanize him in small matters, and make him more sociable, endurable, and considerate, when ambition has completed the coarser work of making him useful. 594. Philosophical novices. Immediately we have comprehended the wisdom of a philosopher, we go through the streets with a feeling as if we had been recreated and had become great men, for we encounter only those who are ignorant of this wisdom, and have therefore to deliver new and unknown verdicts concerning everything. Because we now recognize a law book, we think we must also comport ourselves as judges. 595. Pleasing by displeasing. People who prefer to attract attention and thereby to displease desires the same thing as those who neither wish to please nor to attract attention, only they seek it more ardently and indirectly by means of a step by which they apparently move away from their goal. They desire influence and power, and therefore show their superiority even to such an extent that it becomes disagreeable, for they know that he who has finally attained power pleases in almost all he says and does, and that even when he displeases he still seems to please. The free spirit also, and in like manner the believer, desire power, in order some day to please thereby, when on account of their doctrine evil, fate, persecution, dungeon, or execution threaten them. They rejoice in the thought that their teaching will thus be engraved and branded on the heart of mankind, Though its effect is remote, they accept their fate as a painful but powerful means of still attaining to power. 596. Casus Belli and the like. The prince who, for his determination to make war against his neighbor, invents a casus belli, is like a father who foists on his child a mother who is henceforth to be regarded as such, and are not almost all publicly avowed motives of action just such spurious mothers. 597. Passion and right. Nobody talks more passionately of his rights than he who, in the depths of his soul, is doubtful about them. By getting passion on his side, he seeks to confound his understanding and its doubts. He thus obtains a good conscience, and along with it, success with his fellow men. 598. The trick of the resigning one. He who protests against marriage, after the manner of Catholic priests, will conceive of it in its lowest and vulgarest form. In the same way, he who disavows the honor of his contemporaries will have a mean opinion of it. He can thus dispense with it and struggle against it more easily. Moreover, he who denies himself much in great matters will readily indulge himself in small things. It might be possible that he who is superior to the approbation of his contemporaries would nevertheless not deny himself the gratification of small vanities. 599. The years of presumption. The proper period of presumption in gifted people is between their 26th and 30th years. It is a time of early ripeness, with a large residue of sourness. On the ground of what we feel within ourselves, we demand honor and humility from men who see little or nothing of it, and because this tribute is not immediately forthcoming, we revenge ourselves by the look, the gesture of arrogance, and the tone of voice, which a keen ear and eye recognize in every product of those years, whether it be poetry, philosophy, or pictures and music. Older men of experience smile thereat and think with emotions of those beautiful years in which one resents the fate of being so much and seeming so little. Later on, one really seems more, but one has lost the good belief in being much, unless one remain for life an incorrigible fool of vanity. End of Division 9, Part 1. Division 9, Part 2. Of Human, All Too Human, a Book for Free Spirits, by Friedrich Nietzsche, translated by Helen Zimmern. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Ninth Division, Part 2. Man alone by himself. 600. Deceptive and yet defensible. Just as in order to pass by an abyss or to cross a deep stream on a plank, we require a railing, not to hold fast by, for it would instantly break down with us, but to give the notion of security to the eye, so in youth we require persons who unconsciously render us the service of that railing. It is true they would not help us if we really wished to lean upon them in great danger, but they afford the tranquilizing sensation of protection close to one, for instance, fathers, teachers, friends, as all three usually are. 601. Learning to love. One must learn to love, one must learn to be kind, and this from childhood onwards. When education and chance give us no opportunity for the exercise of these feelings, our soul becomes dried up, and even incapable of understanding the fine devices of loving men. In the same way, hatred must be learnt and fostered when one wants to become a proficient hater, otherwise the germ of it will gradually die out. 602. Ruin as ornament. Persons who pass through numerous mental phases retain certain sentiments and habits of their earlier states, which then project like a piece of inexplicable antiquity and grey stonework into their new thought and action, often to the embellishment of the whole surroundings. 603. Love and honor. Love desires, fear avoids. That is why one cannot be both loved and honored by the same person, at least not at the same time, for he who honors recognizes power, that is to say, he fears it, he is in a state of reverential fear, Ehrfurcht. But love recognizes no power, nothing that divides, detaches, superordinates, or subordinates, because it does not honor then. Ambitious people secretly or openly resent being loved. 604. A prejudice in favor of cold natures. People who quickly take fire grow cold quickly, and therefore are, on the whole, unreliable. For those, therefore, who are always cold, or pretend to be so, there is the favorable prejudice that they are particularly trustworthy, reliable persons. They are confounded with those who take fire slowly and retain it long. 605. The danger in free opinions. Frivolous occupation with free opinions has a charm, like a kind of itching. If one yields to it further, one begins to chafe the places, until at last an open, painful wound results. That is to say, until the free opinion begins to disturb and torment us in our position in life and in our human relations. 606. Desire for sore affliction. When passion is over, it leaves behind an obscure longing for it, and even in disappearing, it casts a seductive glance at us. It must have afforded a kind of pleasure to have been beaten with this scourge. Compared with it, the more moderate sensations appear insipid. We still prefer, apparently, the more violent displeasure to languid delight. 607. Dissatisfaction with others and with the world. When, as so frequently happens, we vent our dissatisfaction on others when we are really dissatisfied with ourselves, we are in fact attempting to mystify and deceive our judgment. We desire to find a motive a posteriori for this dissatisfaction in the mistakes or deficiencies of others, and so lose sight of ourselves. Strictly religious people, who have been relentless judges of themselves, have, at the same time, spoken most ill of humanity generally. There has never been a saint who reserved sin for himself and virtue for others, any more than a man who, according to Buddha's rule, hides his good qualities from people and only shows his bad ones. 608. Confusion of cause and effect. Unconsciously we seek the principles and opinions which are suited to our temperament, so that at last it seems as if these principles and opinions had formed our character and given it support and stability, whereas exactly the contrary has taken place. Our thoughts and judgments are apparently to be taken subsequently as the causes of our nature, but as a matter of fact our nature is the cause of our so thinking and judging. And what induces us to play this almost unconscious comedy? Inertness and convenience, and to a large extent also the vain desire to be regarded as thoroughly consistent and homogeneous in nature and thought, for this wins respect and gives confidence and power. 609. Age in relation to truth. Young people love what is interesting and exceptional, indifferent whether it is truth or falsehood. Riper minds love what is interesting and extraordinary when it is truth. Matured minds finally love truth even in those in whom it appears plain and simple and is found tiresome by ordinary people, because they have observed that truth is in the habit of giving utterance to its highest intellectual verities with all the appearance of simplicity. 610. Men as bad poets. Just as bad poets seek a thought to fit the rhyme in the second half of the verse, so men in the second half of life, having become more scrupulous, are in the habit of seeking pursuits, positions, and conditions which suit those of their earlier life, so that outwardly all sounds well, but their life is no longer ruled and continuously determined anew by a powerful thought. In place thereof there is merely the intention of finding a rhyme. 611. Ennui and play. Necessity compels us to work, with the product of which the necessity is appeased. The ever new awakening of necessity, however, accustoms us to work. But in the intervals in which necessity is appeased, and sleep, as it were, We are attacked by ennui. What is this? In a word, it is the habituation to work, which now makes itself felt as a new and additional necessity. It will be all the stronger the more a person has been accustomed to work, perhaps even the more a person has suffered from necessities. In order to escape ennui, a man either works beyond the extent of his former necessities, or he invents play, that is to say, work that is only intended to appease the general necessity for work. He who has become satiated with play, and has no new necessities impelling him to work, is sometimes attacked by the longing for a third state, which is related to play as gliding is to dancing, as dancing is to walking, a blessed, tranquil movement. It is the artist's and philosopher's vision of happiness. 612. Lessons from pictures. If we look at a series of pictures of ourselves from the time of later childhood to the time of mature manhood, we discover with pleased surprise that the man bears more resemblance to the child than to the youth, that probably therefore, in accordance with this fact, there has been, in the interval, a temporary alienation of the fundamental character, over which the collected concentrated force of the man has again become master. With this observation, this other is also in accordance, namely, that all strong influences of passions, teachers, and political events, which in our youthful years draw us hither and thither, seem later on to be referred back again to a fixed standard. Of course they still continue to exist and operate within us, but our fundamental sentiments and opinions have now the upper hand, and use their influence perhaps as a source of strength, but are no longer merely regulative, as was perhaps the case in our twenties. Thus even the thoughts and sentiments of the man appear more in accordance with those of his childish years, and this objective fact expresses itself in the above mentioned subjective fact. 613. The tone of voice of different ages. The tone in which youths speak, praise, blame, and versify, displeases an older person because it is too loud, and yet at the same time dull and confused, like a sound in a vault, which acquires such a loud ring owing to the emptiness. For most of the thought of youths does not gush forth out of the fullness of their own nature, but is the accord and the echo of what has been thought, said, praised, or blamed around them. As their sentiments, however, their inclinations and aversions, resound much more forcibly than the reasons thereof, there is heard, whenever they divulge these sentiments, the dull clanging tone which is a sign of the absence of scarcity of reasons. The tone of riper age is rigorous, abruptly concise, moderately loud, but, like everything distinctly articulated, is heard very far off. Old age, finally, often brings a certain mildness and consideration into the tone of the voice, and as it were sweetens it. In many cases, to be sure, it also sours it. 614. The atavist and the forerunner. The man of unpleasant character, full of distrust, envious of the success of fellow competitors and neighbors, violent and enraged at divergent opinions, shows that he belongs to an earlier grade of culture, and is therefore an atavism. For the way in which he behaves to people was right and suitable only for an age of club law. He is an atavist. The man of a different character, rich in sympathy, winning friends everywhere, finding all that is growing and becoming amiable, rejoicing at the honors and successes of others, and claiming no privilege of solely knowing the truth, but full of modest distrust. He is a forerunner who presses up towards a higher human culture. The man of unpleasant character dates from the times when the rude basis of human intercourse had yet to be laid. The other lives on the upper floor of the edifice of culture, removed as far as possible from the howling and raging wild beast, imprisoned in the cellars. 615. Consolation for hypochondriacs. When a great thinker is temporarily subjected to hypochondriacal self-torture, he can say to himself by way of consolation, "It is thine own great strength on which this parasite feeds and grows. If thy strength were smaller, thou wouldst have less to suffer." The statesman may say just the same thing when jealousy and vengeful feeling, or in a word, the tone of the bellum omnium contra omnes, for which, as the representative of a nation, he must necessarily have a great capacity, occasionally intrudes into his personal relations and makes his life hard. 616. Estranged from the present. There are great advantages in estranging oneself for once to a large extent from one's age, and being, as it were, driven back from its shores into the ocean of past views of things. Looking thence towards the coast, one commands a view, perhaps for the first time, of its aggregate formation, and when one again approaches the land, one has the advantage of understanding it better, on the whole, than those who have never left it. 617. Sowing and reaping on the field of personal defects. Men like Rousseau understand how to use their weaknesses, defects, and vices as manure for their talent. When Rousseau bewails the corruption and degeneration of society as the evil results of culture, there is a personal experience at the bottom of it, the bitterness which gives sharpness to his general condemnation and poisons the arrows with which he shoots. He unburdens himself first as an individual, and thinks of getting a remedy which, while benefiting society directly, will also benefit himself indirectly by means of society. 618. Philosophically minded. We usually endeavor to acquire one attitude of mind, one set of opinions for all situations and events of life. It is mostly called being philosophically minded. But for the acquisition of knowledge it may be of greater importance not to make ourselves thus uniform, but to hearken to the low voice of the different situations in life. These bring their own opinions with them. We thus take an intelligent interest in the life and nature of many persons by not treating ourselves as rigid, persistent, single individuals. 619. In the fire of contempt. It is a fresh step towards independence when one first dares to give utterance to opinions which it is considered as disgraceful for a person to entertain. Even friends and acquaintances are then accustomed to grow anxious. The gifted nature must also pass through this fire. It afterwards belongs far more to itself. 620. Self-sacrifice. In the event of choice, a great sacrifice is preferred to a small one, because we compensate ourselves for the great sacrifice by self-admiration, which is not possible in the case of a small one. 621. Love as an artifice. Whoever really wishes to become acquainted with something new, whether it be a person, an event, or a book, does well to take up the matter with all possible love, and to avert his eye quickly from all that seems hostile, objectionable, and false therein; in fact, to forget such things, so that, for instance, he gives the author of a book the best start possible, and straightway, just as in a race, longs with beating heart that he may reach the goal. In this manner one penetrates to the heart of the new thing, to its moving point, and this is called becoming acquainted with it. This stage having been arrived at, the understanding afterwards makes its restrictions. The overestimation and the temporary suspension of the critical pendulum were only artifices to lure forth the soul of the matter. 622. Thinking too well and too ill of the world. Whether we think too well or too ill of things, we always have the advantage of deriving therefrom a greater pleasure, for with a too good preconception we usually put more sweetness into things, experiences, than they actually contain. A too bad preconception causes a pleasant disappointment. The pleasantness that lay in the things themselves is increased by the pleasantness of the surprise. A gloomy temperament, however, will have the reverse experience in both cases. 623. Profound people. Those whose strength lies in the deepening of impressions. They are usually called profound people, are relatively self-possessed, and decided in all sudden emergencies, for in the first moment the impression is still shallow, it only then becomes deep. Long foreseen, long expected events or persons, however, excite such natures most, and make them almost incapable of eventually having presence of mind on the arrival thereof. 624. Intercourse with the higher self. Every one has his good day when he finds his higher self, and true humanity demands that a person shall be estimated according to this state, and not according to his work days of constraint and bondage. A painter, for instance, should be appraised and honored according to the most exalted vision he could see and represent. But men themselves commune very differently with this their higher self, and are frequently their own play actors, in so far as they repeatedly imitate what they are in those moments. Some stand in awe and humility before their ideal, and would fain deny it. They are afraid of their higher self, because when it speaks pretentiously. Besides, it has a ghost-like freedom of coming and staying away just as it pleases. On that account it is often called a gift of the gods, while in fact everything else is a gift of the gods, of chance. This, however, is the man himself. 625. Lonely people. Some people are so much accustomed to being alone in self-communion that they do not at all compare themselves with others, but spin out their soliloquizing life in a quiet, happy mood, conversing pleasantly and even hilariously with themselves. If, however, they are brought to the point of comparing themselves with others, they are inclined to a brooding underestimation of their own worth, so that they have first to be compelled by others to form once more a good and just opinion of themselves, and even from this acquired opinion they will always want to subtract and abate something. We must not therefore grudge certain persons their loneliness, or foolishly commiserate them on that account, as is so often done. 626. Without melody. There are persons to whom a constant repose in themselves and the harmonious ordering of all their capacities is so natural that every definite activity is repugnant to them. They resemble music which consists of nothing but prolonged harmonious accords, without even the tendency to an organized and animated melody showing itself. All external movement serves only to restore to the boat its equilibrium on the sea of harmonious euphony. Modern men usually become excessively impatient when they meet such natures, who will never be anything in the world, only it is not allowable to say of them that they are nothing. But in certain moods the sight of them raises the unusual question, why should there be melody at all? Why should it not suffice us when life mirrors itself peacefully in a deep lake? The Middle Ages were richer in such natures than our times. How seldom one now meets with any one who can live on so peacefully and happily with himself, even in the midst of the crowd, saying to himself like Goethe, "The best thing of all is the deep calm in which I live and grow in opposition to the world, and gain what it cannot take away from me with fire and sword." 627. To live and experience. If we observe how some people can deal with their experiences, their unimportant everyday experiences, so that these become soil which yields fruit thrice a year, whilst others, and how many, are driven through the surf of the most exciting adventures, the most diversified movements of times and peoples, and yet always remain light, always remain on the surface like cork. We are finally tempted to divide mankind into a minimality of those who know how to make much out of little, and a majority of those who know how to make little out of much. Indeed, we even meet with the counter sorcerers, who, instead of making the world out of nothing, make a nothing out of the world. 628. Seriousness in play. In Genoa, one evening in the twilight, I heard from a tower a long chiming of bells. It was never like to end, and sounded as if insatiable above the noise of the streets, out into the evening sky and sea air, so thrilling, and at the same time so childish and so sad. I then remembered the words of Plato, and suddenly felt the force of them in my heart. Human matters, one and all, are not worthy of great seriousness, nevertheless. 629. Conviction and justice. The requirement that a person must afterwards, when cool and sober, stand by what he says, promises, and resolves during passion, is one of the heaviest burdens that weigh upon mankind. To have to acknowledge for all future time the consequences of anger, of fiery revenge, of enthusiastic devotion, may lead to a bitterness against these feelings proportionate to the idolatry with which they are idolized, especially by artists. These cultivate to its full extent the esteem of the passions, and have always done so. To be sure, they also glorify the terrible satisfaction of the passions which a person affords himself, the outbreaks of vengeance, with death, mutilation, or voluntary banishment in their train, and the resignation of the broken heart. In any case, they keep alive curiosity about the passions. It is as if they said, without passions you have no experience whatever. Because we have sworn fidelity, perhaps even to a purely fictitious being, such as a god, because we have surrendered our heart to a prince, a party, a woman, a priestly order, an artist, or a thinker, in a state of infatuated delusion, that threw a charm over us, and made those beings appear worthy of all veneration and every sacrifice, are we therefore firmly and inevitably bound, Or did we not, after all, deceive ourselves then? Was there not a hypothetical promise under the tacit presupposition that those beings to whom we consecrated ourselves were really the beings they seemed to be in our imagination? Are we under obligation to be faithful to our errors, even with the knowledge that by this fidelity we may cause injury to our higher selves? No, there is no law, no obligation of that sort. We must become traitors, we must act unfaithfully, and abandon our ideals again and again. We cannot advance from one period of life into another without causing these pains of treachery and also suffering from them. Might it be necessary to guard against the ebullitions of our feelings in order to escape these pains? Would not the world then become too arid, too ghost-like for us? Rather will we ask ourselves whether these pains are necessary on a change of convictions, or whether they do not depend on a mistaken opinion and estimate. Why do we admire a person who remains true to his convictions, and despise him who changes them? I fear the answer must be, because every one takes for granted that such a change is caused only by motives of more general utility or of personal trouble. That is to say, we believe at bottom that nobody alters his opinions as long as they are advantageous to him, or at least as long as they do not cause him any harm. If it is so, however, it furnishes a bad proof of the intellectual significance of all convictions. Let us once examine how convictions arise, and let us see whether their importance is not greatly overestimated. It will thereby be seen that the change of convictions also is in all circumstances judged according to a false standard, that we have hitherto been accustomed to suffer too much from this change. 630. Conviction is belief in the possession of absolute truth on any matter of knowledge. This belief takes it for granted, therefore, that there are absolute truths, also that perfect methods have been found for attaining to them, and finally that every one who has convictions makes use of these perfect methods. All three notions show at once that the man of convictions is not the man of scientific thought. He seems to us still in the age of theoretical innocence, and is practically a child, however grown up he may be. Whole centuries, however, have been lived under the influence of those childlike presuppositions, and out of them have flowed the mightiest sources of human strength. The countless numbers who sacrificed themselves for their convictions believed they were doing it for the sake of absolute truth. They were all wrong, however. Probably no one has ever sacrificed himself for truth. At least the dogmatic expression of the faith of any such person has been unscientific, or only partly scientific. But really people wanted to carry their point because they believed that they must be in the right. To allow their belief to be wrested from them probably meant calling in question their eternal salvation. In an affair of such extreme importance, the will was too audibly the prompter of the intellect. The presupposition of every believer, of every shade of belief, has been that he could not be confuted. If the counter-arguments happened to be very strong, it always remained for him to decry intellect generally, and perhaps even to set up the credo quia absurdum est as the standard of extreme fanaticism. It is not the struggle of opinions that has made history so turbulent, but the struggle of belief in opinions, that is to say, of convictions. If all those who thought so highly of their convictions, who made sacrifices of all kinds for them, and spared neither honor, body, nor life in their service, had only devoted half of their energy to examining their right to adhere to this or that conviction, and by what road they arrived at it, how peaceable would the history of mankind now appear! How much more knowledge would there be! All the cruel scenes in connection with the persecution of heretics of all kinds would have been avoided, for two reasons. Firstly, because the inquisitors would above all have inquired of themselves, and would have recognized the presumption of defending absolute truth; and secondly, because the heretics themselves would, after examination, have taken no more interest in such badly established doctrines as those of all religious sectarians and orthodox believers. 631. From the ages in which it was customary to believe in the possession of absolute truth, people have inherited a profound dislike of all skeptical and relative attitudes with regard to questions of knowledge. They mostly prefer to acquiesce, for good or evil, in the convictions of those in authority, fathers, friends, teachers, princes, and they have a kind of remorse of conscience when they do not do so. This tendency is quite comprehensible, and its results furnish no ground for condemnation of the course of the development of human reason. The scientific spirit in man, however, has gradually to bring to maturity the virtue of cautious forbearance, the wise moderation, which is better known in practical than in theoretical life, and which, for instance, Goethe has represented in Antonio as an object of provocation for all Tassos. That is to say, for unscientific and at the same time inactive natures. The man of convictions has in himself the right not to comprehend the man of cautious thought, the theoretical Antonio. The scientific man, on the other hand, has no right to blame the former on that account. He takes no notice thereof, and knows, moreover, that in certain cases the former will yet cling to him, as Tasso finally clung to Antonio. 632. He who has not passed through different phases of conviction, but sticks to the faith in whose net he was first caught, is under all circumstances, just on account of this unchangeableness, a representative of atavistic culture. In accordance with this lack of culture, which always presupposes plasticity for culture, he is severe, unintelligent, unteachable, without liberality, an ever suspicious person, an unscrupulous person who has recourse to all expedients for enforcing his opinions, because he cannot conceive that there must be other opinions. He is, in such respects, perhaps a source of strength, and even wholesome in cultures that have become too emancipated and languid, but only because he strongly incites to opposition, for thereby the delicate organization of the new culture, which is forced to struggle with him, becomes strong itself. 633. In essential respects, we are still the same men as those of the time of the Reformation. How could it be otherwise? But the fact that we no longer allow ourselves certain means for promoting the triumph of our opinions distinguishes us from that age, and proves that we belong to a higher culture. He who still combats and overthrows opinions with calumnies and outbursts of rage, after the manner of the Reformation men, obviously betrays the fact that he would have burnt his adversaries had he lived in other times, and that he would have resorted to all the methods of the Inquisition if he had been an opponent of the Reformation. The Inquisition was rational at that time, for it represented nothing else than the universal application of martial law, which had to be proclaimed throughout the entire domain of the Church, and which, like all martial law, gave a right to the extremest methods, under the presupposition, of course, which we now no longer share with those people, that the Church possessed truth, and had to preserve it at all costs, and at any sacrifice, for the salvation of mankind. Now, however, one does not so readily concede to any one that he possesses the truth. Strict methods of investigation have diffused enough of distrust and precaution, that every one who violently advocates opinions in word and deed is looked upon as an enemy of our modern culture, at least as an atavist. As a matter of fact, the pathos that man possesses truth is now of very little consequence in comparison with the certainly milder and less noisy pathos of the search for truth, which is never weary of learning afresh and examining anew. 634. Moreover, the methodical search for truth is itself the outcome of those ages in which convictions were at war with each other. If the individual had not cared about his truth, that is to say, about carrying his point, there would have been no method of investigation. Thus, however, by the eternal struggle of the claims of different individuals to absolute truth, people went on step by step to find irrefragable principles, according to which the rights of the claims could be tested and the dispute settled. At first, people decided according to authorities. Later on, they criticized one another's ways and means of finding the presumed truth. In the interval, there was a period when people deduced the consequences of the adverse theory, and perhaps found them to be productive of injury and unhappiness, from which it was then to be inferred by every one that the conviction of the adversary involved an error. The personal struggle of the thinker at last so sharpened his methods that real truths could be discovered, and the mistakes of former methods exposed before the eyes of all. 635. On the whole, scientific methods are at least as important results of investigation as any other results, for the scientific spirit is based upon a knowledge of method, and if the methods were lost, all the results of science could not prevent the renewed prevalence of superstition and absurdity. Clever people may learn as much as they like of the results of science, but one still notices in their conversation, and especially in the hypotheses they make, that they lack the scientific spirit. They have not the instinctive distrust of the devious courses of thinking which, in consequence of long training, has taken root in the soul of every scientific man. It is enough for them to find any kind of hypothesis on a subject; they are then all on fire for it, and imagine the matter is thereby settled. To have an opinion is with them equivalent to immediately becoming fanatical for it, and finally taking it to heart as a conviction. In the case of an unexplained matter, they become heated for the first idea that comes into their head which has any resemblance to an explanation, a course from which the worst results constantly follow, especially in the field of politics. On that account everybody should nowadays have become thoroughly acquainted with at least one science, for then surely he knows what is meant by method, and how necessary is the extremest carefulness. To women in particular this advice is to be given at present. As to those who are irretrievably the victims of all hypotheses, especially when these have the appearance of being witty, attractive, enlivening, and invigorating, indeed on close inspection one sees that by far the greater number of educated people still desire convictions from a thinker, and nothing but convictions, and that only a small minority want certainty. The former want to be forcibly carried away in order thereby to obtain an increase of strength. The latter few have the real interest which disregards personal advantages and the increase of strength also. The former class, who greatly predominate, are always reckoned upon when the thinker comports himself and labels himself as a genius, and thus views himself as a higher being to whom authority belongs. In so far as genius of this kind upholds the ardor of convictions and arouses distrust of the cautious and modest spirit of science, it is an enemy of truth, however much it may think itself the wooer thereof. 636. There is certainly also an entirely different species of genius, that of justice, and I cannot make up my mind to estimate it lower than any kind of philosophical, political, or artistic genius. Its peculiarity is to go, with heartfelt aversion, out of the way of everything that blinds and confuses people's judgment of things. It is consequently an adversary of convictions, for it wants to give their own to all, whether they be living or dead, real or imaginary, and for that purpose it must know thoroughly. It therefore places everything in the best light, and goes around it with careful eyes. Finally, it will even give to its adversary the blind or short-sighted conviction, as men call it. Among women it is called faith, what is due to conviction, for the sake of truth. 637. Opinions evolve out of passions. Indolence of intellect allows those to congeal into convictions. He, however, who is conscious of himself as a free, restless, lively spirit, can prevent this congelation by constant change. And if he is altogether a thinking snowball, he will not have opinions in his head at all, but only certainties and properly estimated probabilities. But we who are of a mixed nature, alternately inspired with ardor and chilled through and through by the intellect, want to kneel before justice as the only goddess we acknowledge. The fire in us generally makes us unjust and impure in the eyes of our goddess. In this condition we are not permitted to take her hand, and the serious smile of her approval never rests upon us. We reverence her as the veiled Isis of our life. With shame we offer her our pain as penance and sacrifice when the fire threatens to burn and consume us. It is the intellect that saves us from being utterly burnt and reduced to ashes. It occasionally drags us away from the sacrificial altar of justice, or enwraps us in a garment of asbestos. Liberated from the fire and impelled by the intellect, we then pass from opinion to opinion through the change of parties, as noble betrayers of all things that can in any way be betrayed, and nevertheless without a feeling of guilt. 638. The Wanderer. He who has attained intellectual emancipation to any extent cannot for a long time regard himself otherwise than as a wanderer on the face of the earth, and not even as a traveler towards a final goal, for there is no such thing, but he certainly wants to observe and keep his eyes open to whatever actually happens in the world. Therefore he cannot attach his heart too firmly to anything individual. He must have in himself something wandering, that takes pleasure in change and transitoriness. To be sure, such a man will have bad nights when he is weary and finds the gates of the town that should offer him rest closed. Perhaps he may also find that, as in the East, the desert reaches to the gates, that wild beasts howl far and near, that a strong wind arises, and that robbers take away his beasts of burden. Then the dreadful night closes over him like a second desert upon the desert, and his heart grows weary of wandering. Then, when the morning sun rises upon him, glowing like a deity of anger, when the town is opened, he sees perhaps in the faces of the dwellers therein still more desert, uncleanliness, deceit, and insecurity than outside the gates, and the day is almost worse than the night. Thus it may occasionally happen to the wanderer, but then there come as compensation the delightful mornings of other lands and days, when already in the gray of the dawn he sees the throng of muses dancing by close to him in the midst of the mountain, when afterwards, in the symmetry of his ante-meridian soul, he strolls silently under the trees, out of whose crests and leafy hiding places all manner of good and bright things are flung to him, the gifts of all the free spirits who are at home in mountains, forests, and solitudes, and who, like himself, alternately merry and thoughtful, are wanderers and philosophers. Born of the secrets of the early dawn, they ponder the question how the day, between the hours of 10 and 12, can have such a pure, transparent, and gloriously cheerful countenance. They seek the ante-meridian philosophy. End of Division 9, Part 2. An Epode of Human, All Too Human, a book for free spirits by Friedrich Nietzsche, translated by Helen Zimmern. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. An Epode Among Friends, translated by T. Common. Nice when mute we lie a-dreaming, nicer still when we are laughing, 'neath the sky heaven's chariot speeding, on the moss the book a-reading. Sweetly, loud, with friends all laughing, joyous, with white teeth a-gleaming. Do I well? We're mute and humble. Do I ill? We'll laugh exceeding. Make it worse and worse, unheeding, worse proceeding, more laughs needing, till into the grave we stumble. Friends, yea, so shall it obtain. Amen, till we meet again. 2. No excuses need be started. Give, ye glad ones, open-hearted, to this foolish book before you. Ear and heart and lodging meet. Trust me, 'twas not meant to bore you, though of folly I may treat. What I find, seek, and am needing, was it e'er in book for reading? Honor now, fools, in my name, learn from out this book by reading, how our sense from reason came. Thus, my friends, shall it obtain. Amen, till we meet again. End of An Epode. End of Human, All Too Human, a book for free spirits by Friedrich Nietzsche, translated by Helen Zimmern, 1846 to 1934.